Thank you, Mrs. Elizabeth Smith. You're a lifesaver. You're welcome, smiled the neighbor. What's wrong with babysitting? I sit at home all day, bored. And here I have something to do. I know how hard it is for you. I was the same way when I was your age, but at least I had a husband to help me, and you're all alone. I had a husband too, Kate sighed. Yeah, I remember your Peter. What kind of helper is he? Said the neighbor. I don't think so, Mrs. Smith, Kate objected. Oh, we've been talking too much. I've got to go. Thank you very much again for your help. Well, run along then. Go on, don't worry. Kate turned away from the older woman before she could see the tears in her eyes. She ran down the stairs, not even thinking about the existence of a lift, and went to work on automatic, almost without seeing the road. A phrase casually thrown by a neighbor awakened bitter memories. Kate had no luck in her personal life, or life in general, for that matter, and once she'd seen a perfectly happy and cloudless future. She, a very young first-year student, was waiting for a brilliant career and a happy marriage with the man she loved, wealthy enough to provide for her future and their future children for the rest of their lives. Kate did not have the opportunity to choose both. The groom was categorically opposed not only to the work of his future wife, but even to the fact that she finished her studies. Why do you need it? Surprised and slightly displeased, he asked. What do you lack? I have money, I have everything. Live and be happy. I don't know myself, Kate answered confusedly. But I'm supposed to get an education, a profession. You never know. What do you mean? You never know. The groom was indignant. Are you not married yet and already decided to bury me? No, of course not. What do you mean? Well, that's good. Then it's settled. My wife should provide a cozy home and raise the children, not go to work in institutes. I'll take care of the rest. Agreed? It's a deal, Kate smiled, and she was beginning to think that yes, indeed, that's how it should be. And why was she getting herself worked up and making up some nonsense? It was obvious that the groom was absolutely right. What bad things can happen? Why all these doubts and reflections? Everything's going to be just fine. At first, everything really went according to plan. Her life was easy and pleasant. She dealt with various household trifles without filling her head with complicated formulas and equations. She didn't have to get up early in the morning, drag herself across town to her classes. If she needed something, her husband bought it without too many questions and arguments. In short, it seemed to young Kate that she was in a real fairy tale. And then they found out that they were expecting a child. It was happy news. Kate dreamed of having a big family, and this is her deepest desire began to materialize. But the pregnancy had not been easy. She could no longer fulfill her domestic duties as well as before. A huge amount of energy was taken away by the future baby, which already at this stage required the closest attention. My husband did not like this arrangement at all. At first he tolerated, expecting apparently that Kate, having got used to her new position, will again begin to provide the house with a proper level of comfort. But it only got worse. By the 8th month, she could hardly move around the house, let alone do anything else. For the umpteenth time, I come home and see the floor hasn't been cleaned, a mountain of dishes in the sink, and absolutely nothing to eat. My husband was indignant. Honey, I'm sorry, but pregnancy is really wearing me out. I'm having a really hard time carrying our baby. And just a little more patience, and everything will be like before, Kate said, almost crying. She herself was very unpleasant about the whole situation, but she had no idea how to fix it. Why are you so tired? Is it from idleness, sitting at home all day, doing nothing but staring at the ceiling? And you're covering for the kid. I've put up with this for too long. There's a limit to everything, replied the husband. Such scandals became a regular occurrence in their house. Nevertheless, each time Kate somehow managed to calm her husband down, and for a short while there was relative peace again, and then it would start all over again. And so on and on until it was time for her to go to the maternity hospital. The labor was almost harder on Kate than all the previous months put together. Nevertheless, when it was finally over, she breathed a sigh of relief. She had given birth to a perfectly healthy, strong boy, and now, holding him in her arms, she realized that it had not all been for nothing. Life was starting to get back on track, led to all the other duties of Kate added to the care of the baby, but disappeared all-consuming heaviness and apathy that accompanied her throughout the pregnancy. And she tried 3 times as hard to somehow compensate her husband for the inconvenience that he was forced to endure all these months. However, her efforts did not bring any visible results. Her husband, though he had grown a little warmer towards her, still did not show her the same love and care as before. In addition, he did not seem to be interested in his own son, though it would seem that he was his firstborn son, his heir. After a year of living like this, Kate took a desperate step. Despite the heavy memories of her previous pregnancy, she realized that she wanted a second child. Among other things, Kate hoped that this time she would be ready, and everything would go much easier. And her husband, of course, will notice her efforts and will love at least the second child. The first one was associated with painful memories for him. And there, look, it will dissipate like smoke. In some ways, Kate was right. It was much easier to bear a new pregnancy than the previous one. Despite the presence of a son in her arms and the sleepless nights associated with it, she literally fluttered around the house, it seemed, even more than before. Her own successes encouraged her, making her hope for the best. Her husband, on the other hand, did not seem to notice the changes that should have pleased him. In those rare moments when he appeared at home, the man wandered glumly from room to room, as if he were looking for something to pick at. He'd find some dust that Kate hadn't noticed, or something else in the same vein. "Where are we going with the second one?" he grumbled. "You can't even handle the first one." "But we wanted a big family," Kate objected timidly, "and at least 4 wonderful kids. Remember, 2 boys and 2 girls. "It's not as if anyone ever wanted anything," her husband said irritably. "As they wanted, so they didn't want. But you can see I'm doing much better this time." "Sweetheart, don't be angry, we'll be fine," Kate tried to convince him. "I don't see it. I don't think it makes much difference. You didn't do anything last time, and you're not doing anything now. I think you're just using the pregnancy as an excuse. You should be getting a job." "You were the one who was against me working." Kate was righteously indignant. "And now you see I don't. And now I've got kids. I can't afford it. Besides, where am I going to go without an education? Dishwasher?" "Not my problem," coldly replied the husband. That was usually the end of the conversation. Kate didn't understand what was going on or why he was behaving this way. After all, she had eliminated all the problems that interfered with their happiness. Couldn't he see how hard she was trying? Doesn't he understand how hard it all cost her? No, he didn't. Or maybe he didn't want to. And to the nagging about the lack of coziness in the house began to add others concerning her appearance. "You used to be beautiful," he would say, as if in between. "And now what?" Kate asked resentfully. "Look at you. Your back is all hunched over. You should go to the gym. You don't do anything all day anyway." Kate didn't answer, realizing that she would exacerbate the conflict. However, it did not help. Her husband continued to pour reproaches, which were already bordering on insults. Everything came to a head on the very day when Kate had to go to the hospital to give birth to her second child. "Pack your things," her husband told her indifferently. "You're not coming back here." What do you mean?" Kate was stunned. "It's like this," he said. "I have a new woman now, and I'm divorcing you. And don't think you can take anything from me. All the property is prenuptial. So there's nothing in it for you. Take what you came with and go wherever you want." Kate didn't argue or make a scene. She looked intently into her husband's eyes and asked only one question. When? What he didn't understand. When did it all start? When did you have another woman? A long time ago. Actually, he answered indifferently. Before Sam was born. I see, she nodded simply. So it was too late to fix it then. Why hadn't she realized that? Suddenly, Kate realized that she didn't want to cry or throw a tantrum or take revenge on her husband or her rival or even try to win his affection back. She was dead tired of everything that was going on. And now she suddenly felt a kind of lightness, a freedom, as if a heavy weight had fallen from her shoulders. From the maternity hospital, she returned to her flat, which she had inherited from her late parents, after her husband's luxurious mansion to a young woman, in a small flat on the outskirts of the city, seemed not too cozy dwelling, but there were no other options. After all, Kate had spent most of her life in this house, and she was sure she'd get used to it somehow. Besides, she didn't have to think about herself, but about her two beautiful children. After all, Sam had a little sister who was going through the most tender period of her life and needed special care. That's when Kate met Mrs. Elizabeth Smith. The elderly, but quite perky woman immediately noticed the return home of the girl, whom she knew in early childhood. She was the first to approach her on the walk. As she began to talk, Kate did not notice how she recounted all her sorrows and problems. "You can't expect anything else from these men," her neighbor reassured her. "No, there are good things, of course, like my late Matthew, for instance. But it's so rare." "I don't think it's that bad," Mrs. Smith replied shyly to Kate. "Oh, Kate, you're young. You don't know the world." "Well, that's not the point. It must be hard for you to be alone with the children, isn't it?" "It's a bit hard," Kate admitted honestly. "I've got to get a job. Who am I going to leave them with? It's not even kindergarten yet." "I'll tell you what," said the woman cheerfully. "You can leave them to me. I sit here, bored all day long. At least this way I'll have something to do." Really, Kate couldn't believe her ears. "Thank you." However, she never found a permanent job. During the search, she had a few odd jobs and used government benefits. It was enough to live on, even if it wasn't as good as she was used to. And then an event happened that made Kate forget about everything in the world. She fell in love again. Peter was an aspiring businessman with his own small business. He himself approached Kate when she was walking with the kids. The presence of children did not embarrass him at all, which of course only added points in Kate's eyes. "Could I meet you?" he asked bluntly. "I'm sorry, I've been watching you for a long time. I like you a lot." Aren't you afraid to approach a stranger with a pram?" Kate asked flirtatiously. "What if I have a husband, and also terribly jealous? That would be very sad. And in that case, of course, I would not insist on further acquaintance. But if suddenly he is no longer there, I have honestly never seen him with you, then I would be very happy to continue the conversation." The relationship developed very quickly, and soon they got married and moved into Peter's slightly larger flat, which happened to be in the same building. And Kate's flat was rented out. She continued to work part-time in her spare time and took care of the children. Her new husband was developing his modest business, and they lived, in general, not bad, of course, without much luxury, but in love and harmony. And a few months later, Kate found out that she was pregnant again. Despite the fact that this threatened new serious expenses, the couple were very happy. They managed to exchange their two flats for a two-bedroom flat right next door. They both loved the quiet neighborhood and didn't want to move. This time, Kate had a very difficult time. She had to give birth to two twins, a boy and a girl. Of course, children are happiness, but now there were 4 of them. And that means that the costs had to increase much more than both expected. But there was nothing to do. We managed to cope with all the worries, overcoming the difficulties that arose. Peter worked his arse off. Kate, on the other hand, looked after the children, but also tried to make time to bring some money into the house. Life became an endless cycle of monotonous, hard everyday life. Nevertheless, both believed that things would eventually get better. Peter was gradually expanding his business, which was about to start making a good profit. At least, that's what he told his wife. And Kate had no reason not to believe her much-loved husband, so she didn't object when one day he decided to take out a very large loan. "It'll give us a huge boost," he said excitedly. "I've calculated everything. The scheme should work perfectly. We'll pay it back from the profits." "Of course, darling," she replied. "I don't doubt you at all. Do what you think is right." And Peter did take out the loan. But shortly before the first installment was due, he disappeared. Just one day he didn't come home in the evening. His phone was unavailable. Kate, hoping for a miracle, waited for him all night, and in the morning went to the police station. They took her statement, but immediately warned her not to expect quick results. And indeed, no results followed. Neither in 6 months, nor in a year, could not find neither Peter, nor even his body, as if such a person did not exist in the world. Kate was desperate, except that now she was left alone with 4 children and a completely unsustainable loan. She was convinced that something bad had happened to her husband. It's not enough that the body hadn't been found. Nevertheless, there was neither time nor energy to grieve. I had to somehow manage to feed the kids and myself. All free time was spent on endless part-time jobs, and the state allocated the mother of many children at least some money. But all this is catastrophically lacking. Luckily, Mrs. Elizabeth Smith was always on hand. She agreed to sit with the children, or even brought them some gifts or even food for Kate herself. And of course, it was very uncomfortable to accept such gifts from a stranger. In fact, a man. However, the old woman did not want to hear any refusals. "Don't be silly, Kate," she said. "Convenient, inconvenient, not in the position to talk about it. Take what they give you and be happy. Think of it as a way for me to fulfill my unrealized maternal instinct on you. God never gave me children of my own." "Thank you, Mrs. Elizabeth Smith," was all she could manage to say. "Thank you so much, really. What would we do without you?" "We'd live even more modestly than we do now," replied the neighbor. "Don't rant, but go to work, you're late." However, Kate never found a permanent place, and how could she find one with 4 children on her hands, 2 of whom were too young even for kindergarten, and for the other 2 there was still no cue to put them in kindergarten. Sam will be going to school soon. Mrs. Elizabeth Smith was a great help, of course, but she couldn't sit with other people's children all day long. Even though she always said she was a poor pensioner with nothing to do, Kate knew that wasn't true at all. People of such a nature always have something to do. They just can't sit in one place. And anyway, she didn't want to burden the kind woman too much. So Kate only had to get a job in a cleaning agency, go from one place to another, clean the premises, get paid in cash on the same day. The hours are flexible. You can take only convenient time and place orders. All would be well, but the payment, of course, miserable. And then came the moment that Kate had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. It was time to send Sam to school. On the one hand, it was a relief. After all, now he would at least be under the teacher's supervision for part of the day, which would save her a bit of trouble. On the other, more unpleasant side, the approaching 1st of September brought with it additional expenses, and quite a lot. After all, it was necessary to buy clothes and shoes for her son, befitting a 1st grader, plus all sorts of school supplies like notebooks, pens, and pencils. It was clear that there was nothing new to think about. Kate did the best she could, and still managed to save up for a second-hand suit, a little shabby but looking decent. Mrs. Smith helped with the boots, having obtained a good pair free of charge through acquaintances. All the little things were bought, too. It was the cheapest, but each item fulfilled its function. There was only one thing left, and perhaps the most important, a rucksack. She was running out of money, and Kate couldn't figure out where she could get something that looked decent. She walked home from work with these heavy thoughts. Her way was through a subway, and by a strange coincidence, it was here that she saw what she had been looking for so long. A not too tidy man, whose age was hard to determine because of his thick beard and long unwashed hair, was holding the very backpack in his hand, perfect, as if it had come off the cover of some fashion magazine for schoolchildren. Small, neat, the deep blue color her son loved so much. It was just the right size to hold everything she needed, and it looked light and weightless. In short, just the thing for a 1st grader. When the tramp saw Kate, he perked up. He must have noticed her staring at the backpack in his hands. The rucksack, it must be said, was so new and clean that it would have been more appropriate to see it on a shelf in an expensive shop than in a subway, in the hands of a man of such peculiar appearance. "You like the rucksack. Take it, I'll give it to you cheap. I don't need it." Why not take it, Kate thought. The rucksack was really quite nice. What about the seller? Who cares? He must have found it somewhere and now he wanted to get some money for it. Poor bloke, he must be worse off than Kate. At least she's got a roof over her head. So why not do a little good deed and solve the problem at the same time? She's been suffering for weeks. "How much are you selling it for?" she asked. "And how much are you not sorry?" The tramp answered carelessly, after a moment's thought. Kate gave him all the money she had set aside for the rucksack. After all, she had expected that the money would be spent in this way. It would be unfair to offer him less. The thing was clearly worth more than what she would have paid for it. "That's fine," the man smiled, pocketing the few small notes he had received from Kate. "Let your son wear it with pleasure." "Now how do you know it's for your son?" Kate was wary. "I guessed," he waved his hand. "Not for yourself, really, such a color. It could be for a girl, of course, but it's more logical to assume it's for a boy." "That's right," she smiled. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Kate walked home in high spirits. I bet she'd finally managed to get her son the rucksack she'd been looking for so long. What kind of backpack? It was beautiful. She wanted to show it to Sam as soon as possible. Let the boy be happy too. At least some of his things would be new and beautiful, just as good as the others. But before she showed it to her son, she decided to inspect it properly. After all, there was no telling where the tramp had taken it from or what might be inside. Better to double-check everything, just to be on the safe side. And very soon Kate was convinced of the correctness of such a decision. In one of the compartments, she found a small plastic rectangle. Looking closer, she realized it was a personal bank card. Kate's heart raced. How could this thing get into a child's backpack? And what was to be done with such a find? There were no answers to these questions. After pondering for a few minutes, however, she came to the conclusion that the best solution would be to return the card to the vagrant. Could it possibly belong to him? Doubtful, of course, but it could happen. And even if it didn't, it would be on his conscience, not hers. She just bought the rucksack and paid for it honestly. The rest was not her problem. With that in mind, Kate didn't hesitate and immediately went back to the passage to look for the man who had sold the backpack. However, to her surprise and disappointment, the tramp was no longer there. She even wandered around the neighborhood for a bit, but still couldn't locate him. It was strange. She had thought that the man lived in this passage and was not likely to go far from here at night. Nevertheless, the fact remained that the tramp was nowhere to be found, but the map was. Kate clearly understood that, most likely, there was some money on it, someone else's money, which had to be returned to its rightful owner somehow. Nevertheless, all the way home, she kept thinking that since the owner of the card had left it so carelessly, perhaps she needed the money more than he did. Kate tried to ward off such thoughts, realizing their wrongness and viciousness. But then she came upon a grocery shop. The right and reasonable thoughts that it was wrong to take someone else's goods were immediately replaced by other thoughts. She would be able to buy her children sweets, fruit, and maybe even some new toys. These thoughts drew Kate like a magnet to the shop window. She didn't even notice how she went inside and picked up a basket full of various goodies. The voice of reason woke up only at the checkout, but there was nowhere to retreat. The cashier was staring at her, waiting for her to pay for the purchases she had already made. With trembling hands, Kate pulled a card out of her pocket and, as if watching what was happening in slow motion, applied it to the terminal. There was an ominous pause. The bank was processing the information and deciding whether to authorize the payment. The guard standing near the door somehow got all tense and moved closer to the cashier's area. Kate was clearly a cause of concern for him, and not unfounded. I must say, pale, with trembling hands and shabby, though clean clothes. And then suddenly, there's a basket full of fruit and sweets. Something was amiss. Kate had already vividly imagined how the terminal would inform the cashier that the card had been stolen from its rightful owner. The guard would immediately detain her until the police arrived. And those, of course, will immediately escort the criminal to prison, where she belongs. But the fate of children without both parents will be very unenviable. She almost cried at the obsession. "Thank you for your purchase," the saleswoman said cheerfully, pulling Kate out of the gloomy picture she had painted in her imagination. Not believing her eyes, Kate glanced at the terminal. It was flashing cheerfully with some green light, informing her that the purchase had been successfully paid for. The guard visibly relaxed and leaned back against the wall. The crime had succeeded. On woozy legs, Kate left the shop. On the way home, she had mixed feelings. She really felt like a criminal, a real thief who had taken someone else's property. On the other hand, she was already anticipating the joy of the children, who had so rarely seen anything good in their short lives. The children's reaction to the presents had exceeded her expectations. It had been a long time since she had seen them so happy. It was not that this fact made the pangs of conscience completely silent, but somehow muted them, pushing them to the far edge of consciousness, leaving in the foreground the feeling of maternal pride that she was able to somehow please her children. When she made subsequent purchases with the same card, Kate felt much more confident. However, this did not happen immediately, but only after a couple of weeks. Until then, the woman tried to cope on her own, but the money for the work, as usual, ran out before the next one arrived. And then, having looked in the same supermarket to buy the most ordinary food, Kate again paid with this card. And again, everything went as usual. The purchase was successfully paid for. The children were fed and happy. It seemed to her like some kind of incredible miracle. The next time she decided to use the card was just before the 1st of September. When she got home from work, she told Sam, on impulse rather than common sense, "Let's go to the mall tomorrow. We'll buy you some new clothes for school." "But I already have a suit," her son replied in surprise. "And there will be another new and beautiful one," confidently said the mother. The boy shone. The next day, Kate took the day off, and they really went to the biggest shopping center in the city. Not only with Sam, she decided to organize a small holiday for the whole family, while she and the future first grader chose the best clothes and shoes. The younger ones frolicked in the children's room with many different entertainments, and afterwards all together went to the cafe for juice and ice cream. Each time she put her card to the terminal, Kate froze, fearing that now the miracle would end. And each time the machine happily announced that the payment had been successful. All this began to seem to Kate like some kind of magic, a real, not imaginary miracle, as if some kind angel had sent her this card so that she could provide a decent life for her children. At the same time, however, she kept thinking that she was doing something wrong. In fact, she was using other people's money. And in order to make amends to the mysterious owner of the card, she continued to look for the tramp who had sold her the rucksack. He must know something about where this unusual item had come from, or maybe it even belonged to him. Who knows? More than once Kate had come to the crossing or walked around the neighborhood in the hope of meeting her mysterious, albeit unwitting, benefactor. But the vagrant seemed to have vanished without a trace. Moreover, none of the locals she had had the courage to talk to had ever seen a man of that description in the passage. Kate didn't know what to think. Could it be that she had helped someone once, and now he had decided to thank her in such an unusual way? Or was it all just a coincidence and her luck might run out at any moment, along with the money on the card? She wished she had an answer, but she had no idea where or how exactly to look for them. Time was running out. Kate's search was still fruitless, and the money on the mysterious map seemed to be inexhaustible, as if it really was bottomless. Kate even hired a nanny for her children. Now she could work in complete peace without worrying about whether Mrs. Elizabeth Smith would be able to help her. Simple things like being able to buy food to eat had long ago seemed like something fabulous and unattainable to Kate, and now it was becoming a reality. Twice a week she returned home with bags full of quality food and gifts. She no longer had to choose the cheapest goods for her children or hunt for favorable promotions, comparing prices in almost all shops in the city. She could simply go to the supermarket on her way home and buy everything she needed. From time to time, Kate even allowed herself to treat one of the kids to a new toy. Of course, this mysterious transformation could not go unnoticed by the neighbors. Some, like Mrs. Elizabeth Smith, were genuinely happy that Kate and her family were finally getting on with their lives. Some were jealous, either outright or covertly. Some were suspicious, and some decided that the neighbors' prosperity was a good reason to take advantage of it. Such a person was Andrew, an old local alcoholic, known throughout the house for his drunken antics, as well as the fact that always begging the neighbors for money for a new batch of vodka. Already under the strong influence of this drink, and surprisingly enough, the money was found every time. Andrew noticed that the neighbor upstairs began to live suspiciously well, while he himself remained at the same social bottom. Andrew decided that such an injustice needed to be corrected. By following Kate, he discovered that the source of a woman's wealth was always in her coat pocket. It was not difficult to get the card out of there unnoticed. Satisfied with the successful outcome of the cunning case, Andrew decided that it was necessary to celebrate it immediately and went to the same supermarket, where Kate had already got used to buying food. There he picked up the most elite and expensive alcohol and paid for it from the stolen card without any problems. It is not known how this story would have ended if Andrew had not decided that it was possible to start drinking what he had bought right on the spot. Andrew had already managed to open a bottle of whiskey and even drank a considerable part of its contents. When the guards came up to him and politely informed him that drinking in their shop was strictly forbidden, he was indignant. "I have the right. I bought this whiskey honestly, paid a lot of money for it, and I have the right to drink it." Andrew got heated. "Of course you do," the guard readily agreed, "but not in our establishment. This is a shop, not a bar. Please continue drinking elsewhere." "I can drink where I want," Andrew persisted, not forgetting to pour more and more alcohol into himself. "Dear, if you don't leave the shop immediately, we will be forced to ask for help from the competent authorities." "Go wherever you want," Andrew replied, stammering, "and I will drink wherever I want." This dialogue lasted about half an hour. During this time, the man managed not only to consume a considerable part of what he had bought, but also to smash several shop windows to pieces, as well as to poke one of the guards in the eye. Perhaps there would have been some more events of the same kind if the police had not arrived at that moment. The police took the troublemaker to the station and began to find out more about the circumstances of the case. That's when it turned out that the card Andrew was using didn't belong to him at all, but to some businessman banker, a very respectable and influential man. Upon hearing this, the man sobered up instantly and immediately told the police that the card was certainly not his. Only he had never seen any banker, but had borrowed it from a neighbor, giving Kate's address, of course, and everything he knew about her at that point. When the guards knocked on her door, Kate had not even noticed the disappearance of the card, because she used it only when she did not have enough money of her own, and it had been a short time. However, when Kate looked through the peephole and saw the police officers, she knew immediately what they were after. Without any time to think, they took her straight to the station. All the way she could only think that now she would surely be accused of theft, and soon she would end up in prison and the children in an orphanage. And what's more, they would be labeled as the offspring of a shameless thief for the rest of their lives. Kate didn't feel sorry for herself, believing she fully deserved such a fate, but she was incredibly ashamed. In addition, she was tormented by anxiety for the children, but it was too late to change anything, and she just drove in silence in the police car, absorbed in her thoughts. When they finally reached the station, Kate was ready to be handcuffed and put behind bars, or maybe they'd take her straight to interrogation. But instead, she was escorted into a rather spacious, bright office and seated on a cushioned sofa opposite a man, as she guessed, the owner of the card. To Kate's surprise, his face looked suspiciously familiar. When she looked more closely, she could not restrain a surprised exclamation. The man was now dressed in an expensive suit, clean-shaven and short-cropped, and yet she recognized him unmistakably as the tramp who had sold her the ill-fated rucksack. "Hello," she said timidly to break the awkward silence. "Hello," Katie said. "My name is James, by the way." Kate looked up and was surprised to see him smiling broadly. "I owe you an apology," Kate said. "I stole your money. Of course, I realize it will go beyond that, and I'll have to take the punishment I deserve, but I don't want my children to suffer for my disgusting act. It's not their fault." "And neither are you," James said seriously. "I have no claims against you. Besides, it's official. This card belongs to you. It was a gift from me." He glanced at the policeman, seemingly as surprised as Kate herself, and added, "I hope that settles our little misunderstanding, and that I won't have to worry about such trifles anymore." "Yes, yes, of course," he replied hastily. "You may be free to go." The last phrase was clearly addressed to Kate in a state of complete shock. She stepped outside and only now noticed that James was walking beside her, clearly adjusting his stride to hers. "Why?" was all she asked. "What? Why? You know what I mean. What's with all this rucksack stuff? And why did you suddenly decide to give me this map? You see, the thing is, I'm seriously ill. I'd even say incurable. I can't even be sure I'll wake up tomorrow." "But you're incredibly rich, aren't you?" Kate wondered. "You can afford the best doctors and expensive surgeries." "What good are they?" James said irritably. "I've tried so many things, both the money and the doctors. Nothing works. Now they've invented a new operation again. I don't want it. I don't believe it'll work. I've never worked. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life in hospitals hoping for a miraculous rescue. No, I'll live as long as I can, but I'll live well and brightly. Actually, returning to your question, that's why I decided to help people who need it. I've got a lot of money, but what's the use of it? I'm almost dead. Maybe it'll count for something in the next world. To tell you the truth, I've been watching you for a while. I wanted to make sure that, I was doing a really good deed and not giving the money to someone who would drink it, or something like that. I'm sorry for this assumption, but before that I didn't know you at all. And then I saw you and realized that you are an honest, hard-working woman who genuinely cares about her children. So I thought you needed the money more than I did, and you didn't disappoint me." For some time, Kate looked at this man in silence, trying to comprehend what she had heard. She had a feeling of respect and great admiration for him. And on top of that, of course, gratitude. Not everyone would behave in such a dignified manner when they knew they were dying. "But why all this circus with the rucksack and dressing as a tramp?" she finally asked. "If I just walked up to you on the street and offered to pay for all your expenses, would you agree?" James answered question for question. She shook her head. He smiled. They went their separate ways, but left each other's phone numbers just in case, so that they wouldn't have to resolve any more perplexing situations like today's involving the police. However, it soon became clear to both of them that they needed to communicate with each other. They began a long correspondence in messengers, during which they got to know each other better and better. And, to the surprise of both of them, They found more and more common interests and topics for conversation. At first, communication was infrequent, but over time it became more frequent, longer, and more personal. For the first time in his life, James Young felt that his companion was interested in his soul, not in the contents of his wallet. He definitely liked this new, hitherto unexplored feeling. He realized that he was gradually falling in love with Kate, who, it should be noted, reciprocated it. The only person unhappy with this state of affairs was James's wife. Selfish Amanda was just waiting for the disease to do its work and her husband's money to go only to her. In recent months, she hadn't even tried too hard to hide it, constantly making remarks along the lines of, "James, stop giving my money away to your paupers. You won't need it anytime soon. But what will I live on if you waste it all?" She, as James realized only now, was actively encouraging him to think that no operation could change the inevitable. Although he was afraid to lie down on the surgical table for fear of never getting up again, Kate still managed to persuade him to try it. Soon he went to an expensive private clinic, whose doctors seemed to be his last chance for healing. Unfortunately, the time frame in which this measure could have been guaranteed to save James' life was missed. He did have the operation, and even quite successfully, but its consequences were not the most pleasant. The man fell into a coma, and no one could guarantee that he would be able to get out of it. James's wife was already rubbing her hands together in anticipation when all his wealth would go to her as the only legitimate heiress. Kate was the only one who cared about his fortune. She had grown to love him with all her heart, though they had not known each other very long. She was the only one who had come to his room, bringing flowers and fluffing his pillows to make him comfortable, the only one who had stayed by his side for hours on end. Kate sat by his bedside, hoping he would come round after all, holding his hand and talking to him, as if he could hear and understand her, and the genuine love and care seemed to have borne fruit. True, it took several long months, and on the day when even the doctors, despairing, decided to disconnect James from the machines that kept him alive, the man suddenly moved his lips and quietly but clearly said, "Kate." Kate was immediately called to the hospital. Although it was not very rational from the medical point of view, but it had the desired effect. Hearing the voice of his beloved, James was finally able to open his eyes, and after that, his recovery progressed quite quickly. After only a month, he left the hospital a healthy man. The first thing he did after being discharged was to file divorce papers. Of course, his wife was furious at this turn of events. However, there was nothing she could do about it. She had to accept the fact that the millionaire's money was lost to her forever. And James, having settled all the formalities, made a new marriage proposal. This time to Kate, the happy couple began to prepare for the wedding, which was to take place in just a couple of months. The event was planned very modest. Only the children of Kate and Mrs. Elizabeth Smith were to be present. And here came the solemn day, a beautifully decorated hall, the bride in a white dress, the groom in an expensive suit, satisfied children who had already got used to the man who was to replace their father, and Mrs. Elizabeth Smith, whose elegance could have rivaled Kate's own dress, which, however, did not offend the latter, for she knew how sincerely her good neighbor rejoiced at her happiness. Suddenly, just after the newlyweds had put their signatures on the necessary documents, the door of the hall burst open with a clatter. Kate turned round at the noise and gasped in amazement. She immediately recognized the man who had literally burst into the hall where the ceremony was taking place. It had been a year since she had last seen him. The man had clearly grown fat, and his face was already showing signs of alcoholism, and yet it was hard not to recognize him. It was Peter. The ex-husband frowned and walked quickly towards her. "Kate, wait. You're making a huge mistake," he said in a heartfelt voice. "I thought you were dead," Kate replied, confused. "But as you can see, I'm alive, which means you don't need to remarry. Come back to me, and we'll live as we used to." "Where have you been all this time?" Kate asked rather coldly. "Do you have any idea how we lived without you?" "I do," Peter said in a pompous tone. "That's why I ran away from it. All those kids. I thought I'd try to start over. With another woman. I'm sorry, I was wrong. It didn't work out. Come back to me. And the loan, so you took not for business development, but for a new happy life with another woman." Kate's voice became completely icy. "I'm sorry, Kate, I was a fool, but not anymore," he begged. She answered stiffly. "Go back where you came from. and don't let me see you again. I have a new life now. And, as you can see, quite a happy one. The mask of repentance and peacefulness instantly disappeared from Peter's face, replaced by a vicious grin. "You bitch," Katie spat out. "You've got yourself a rich one. It's all right. You'll regret it." This unpleasantness could not spoil the general impression of the happy event. Immediately after the wedding, James and Kate went on a little trip, and then returned to lead a life together in the luxurious mansion of a businessman. For several long weeks, nothing could dampen their happiness. But one day James came home in an extremely gloomy mood. When Kate asked him why he was in a bad mood, he simply threw a piece of paper in her face. To her surprise and horror, Kate looked at it and discovered that it was a photograph of her in a very racy moment with a man she was seeing for the first time in her life. James didn't want to hear any excuses or explanations. Instead, he poured a stream of reproaches and insults on his wife. They all boiled down to the fact that he thought that he finally found a woman who appreciates his soul, not his wallet. But as you can see, mistaken. That's where Kate came in. If everything we've been through together hasn't convinced you otherwise, I have nothing more to say to you. I'm packing my things and going home right now. Don't bother, James threw back. There's no need to drag the kids back and forth. You stay here and I'll take care of it. He left, and chaotically threw some things into a small bag. Kate was left sitting in the corridor, sobbing at yet another bitter injustice. Once again, she thought she had finally found her happiness, but once again it had been rudely taken from her. And now, it seems, finally. However, there was still some hope. Her husband had left. But he was in no hurry to file for divorce. Too much they got used to each other. Too much they had in common. That's why, despite the quarrel, clearly set up by some ill-wisher, Kate believed that he could still return. Besides, soon after the ugly scandal, she'd realized that she was expecting James to have a child with her. She didn't want to tell him herself. The unfair recriminations and accusations were still ringing in her ears. It went on like this for a while longer. With the expectation of the baby, Kate had new worries. One day she had to go to her old flat to pick up some small things, and to speak to Mrs. Elizabeth Smith, whom she had not seen for some time. But she was so tired of the business that Kate decided to spend the night here, having arranged with her nanny to take care of the children. Kate awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of a key opening the lock. She didn't immediately realize what was happening. She tried to fall back asleep for a while. Only after a few minutes did she realize that she was in her old flat, to which only 2 people besides herself had keys. And Mrs. Elizabeth Smith was certainly not going to barge in on her in the middle of the night, which meant that her assumption received instant confirmation. No sooner had she opened her eyes than a light flashed into the room, blinding her for a few seconds. And then Kate saw Peter standing right beside her bed. "Did you play?" he grinned. "I've been waiting for you to come home for a long time. Honestly, I thought it would be a lot sooner. It took your new hubby a long time before he threw you out." "What are you doing here?" Kate was indignant, letting his words pass her lips. "I want to remind you that the flat is our common property, and I have every right to be here." "Okay," Kate said, not in the mood for conflict. "Then I'm calling a taxi and I'm leaving." "And where will you go?" Peter grinned. "Back to the cuckolded man. I doubt he'll take you back." The world's changed. What Kate gasped as she finally understood the meaning of her ex-husband's insolent behavior. "So it was you who planted those photos." "Well, let's just say I wasn't alone. There's a lovely woman you crossed paths with, too, stole her husband. We just put everything back the way it was." Kate, not wanting to spend another minute in the company of this man, grabbed the phone and began to dial the number of the taxi service. Peter didn't like this behavior. "Where are you going in the middle of the night?" he shouted. "I didn't let you go." "You don't get to decide where." "And when I go," Kate said sharply. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Peter raise his hand, and all she could do was cover her stomach. The blow never came, but the swing was enough to make Kate sick. Luckily, it was at that moment that Mrs. Elizabeth Smith, awakened by a noise in the next flat, came to find out what was wrong and called an ambulance. Kate woke up in the hospital room and found James sitting next to her. holding her hand with a mixture of surprise and joy. Her husband was pale and serious, with dark circles under his eyes. He had obviously been awake for a long time, but when he noticed that Kate had opened her eyes, he smiled with obvious sincerity. "Kate, I'm sorry I didn't believe you," he began. "I should have realized that the photograph was the work of those bastards, but I lost my head when I saw it." "I can understand that," Kate said. The memory came back to her slowly, as if in spurts: the fight with James, the trip home, Peter's sudden appearance, and the wave of his hand. There she was, clutching her stomach. Suddenly there was a sharp chill inside. "Baby," she exclaimed. "What's wrong with the baby?" "Don't worry," James hastened to reassure her. "She's alive and well." "Lucky that girl, by the way, is my daughter." "Who knew?" "When the doctor told me, I couldn't believe it. I thought I was infertile. Now I realized that Amanda was lying to me about wanting children, while she was secretly taking birth control pills." Kate smiled and leaned back against the pillow. The baby was fine, and her beloved husband was once again by her side. What more could one wish for? After a while, she was discharged from the hospital, and together with her husband they returned home. Peter had to pay for his deed with a substantial prison sentence. James made sure that his actions were seen as nothing less than an attempt on the life of his wife and unborn child. Still, from the point of view of the law, Amanda had nothing to accuse him of. However, participation in the conspiracy did not bring her any happiness. Now she earns money working as a temporary cleaner to be able to buy food and rent a modest room on the outskirts of the city. And her numerous attempts to get acquainted with another rich man to live at his expense have brought no results. After selling her house in the village, Stacy reluctantly walked to her son's apartment, and when she saw the suitcase. Stacy walked down the street, struggling to move her legs. She had just returned from the supermarket where she had received her pension. The elderly woman went to the nearest grocery store. She needed to buy potatoes, some meat, and she was almost out of cereals. And also milk, flour, sugar. The bag was heavy. It hadn't been a weight for Stacy before, though. On the farm, she'd thrown hay with a pitchfork, carried huge boxes, and carried buckets full of milk or water. What a lot of things she'd done. But now Stacy was a little over 70, and age, of course, was taking its toll. Her back often ached, her arms weakened. She dragged the bag from the supermarket with great difficulty, slowly stopping every now and then to catch her breath. A couple of times she was offered help by passers-by and two teenagers with school backpacks on their shoulders. A middle-aged woman and a tall young guy also offered help. But Stacy refused with a smile. She was in no hurry to get anywhere. And these kind people, it was immediately obvious, were in a hurry to do their own thing. So why distract them? Stacy wasn't just walking so slowly because of the heavy bag. She just didn't want to go home, and the place she was going back to wasn't what you'd call a refuge. Her house used to be spacious, bright, cozy, with a large kitchen and a stove, 4 rooms with a front garden, and a carved fence that Stacy's father had put up, with beloved friends and neighbors. Close to home was good for Stacy, though her work was hard. She spent most of her life working on the collective farm, tending the animals and cleaning the pens. She worked double shifts to make sure her son had everything he needed. She would leave in the dark and return when the sun was already setting over the horizon. Her back ached, her arms and legs buzzed. Still, the old woman remembered those times with nostalgia. She felt much happier then than she did now. The November cold rain fell suddenly, without warning in Philadelphia, as if someone upstairs had opened a faucet of ice water. Stacy was in a hurry. The walk seemed to be canceled. She'd have to go home. There was nowhere to go. The rain was picking up and the wind was picking up. "No, we can't run home. We have to wait it out." Stacy hurried to the porch of the nearest store. Here, under the canopy, she could stand until the rain stopped, and then she could go home. On the mischievous tiled plaza, people were gathered, cheerful children, for whom the sudden fall downpour was another adventure, and frowning adults, late for their business because of the rain. Stacy's gaze suddenly fell on a young boy. He stood with his back against the wall, staring blankly at the street. Bright birch eyes, sharply defined cheekbones, hair the color of ripe wheat. A real handsome man. He'd probably get a lot of girls. He looked just like Jacob, a guy Stacy had only known for 2 days in her life. That had been almost 40 years ago. And yet the older woman remembered every feature of the man's face, his scent, and the words he'd said to her. Jacob, if he was still alive, had long since forgotten his casual acquaintance. How many of those had he had? Young girls are attracted to good looks. Jacob has no idea that he has played such a role in the life of one of his many admirers. The key guy, the one Stacy was secretly watching, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen, occasionally running his finger over the display. Whether he was watching a video or reading something. Young people are so dependent on these gadgets these days. Whether that was good or bad, Stacy didn't know. Her youth was very different. Stacy was born into a family of a tractor driver and a milkmaid. When she was only 2 years old, she became the oldest child. Her parents had another daughter named Vivi. The family lived poorly but decently. They did not starve, did not go in old clothes, and did not go to resorts. They did not buy fur coats and luxury cars. Their parents worked hard, so Stacy and Vivi learned early to help around the house. Stacy, observing modern children whom she thought were overprotective of their parents, marveled. She and her sister, at 7 or 8 years old, could already mop the floors, cook lunch and dinner. Moreover, the girls cleaned the yard, took care of the livestock, did their own homework and laundry without reminders. And after all, they did not have modern technical wonders that make life much easier: washing machines, dishwashers, and so on. The girls still had a lot of free time. Having coped with the lessons and finished their homework, the sisters with a clear conscience went to the street to their friends. All their peers lived the same way. They had time to do housework and at school and play with their classmates. Stacy and Vivi were always very friendly, supporting each other. Stacy has the fondest memories of her childhood. Then everything was simple, clear, and easy. The future was seen in bright colors. Stacy didn't do well in school. Unlike her little sister, Vivi was a quick learner. Complex formulas were no problem for her. The complex rules of the Russian language seemed to fall into place in her younger sister's head. For Stacy, however, science remained incomprehensible throughout her schooling. She seemed to be trying to learn literacy. She always did her homework. She was not lazy. She did not slack off. But apparently the ability was not given. Vivi understood everything effortlessly. She just had a clear head. Parents were proud of their youngest daughter. Maybe someone from the family will get a higher education, dreamed the mother, to get into the people. Daughter, reasoned the father, you have a head on your shoulders. It's foolish to miss such a chance. You do your best, and we'll help you. Stacy was proud of her sister too, but it hurt her to hear her parents say that. It turned out that her parents really hoped more for Vivi and expected her to succeed in her studies and career. They didn't count on Stacy for that. Vivi tried hard, studied hard, and never bullied her sister. On the contrary, she helped Stacy with her lessons. When Stacy was faced with assignments that were difficult for her, the sisters grew up. Stacy went to study in the city, went to college, choosing a specialty of sewing technologist. The girl has always had an aptitude for needlework. She realized that she would become a good tailor. Wright approved the choice of the eldest daughter's father. The specialty is wonderful. You will not be left without a piece of bread. You have golden hands. Agreed the mother. Bon voyage. After her studies, Stacy decided to stay in the city. She got a job in an atelier, rented an apartment nearby, started taking part-time jobs, and soon Stacy was supporting herself. The atelier paid a small salary, but the part-time jobs helped to make a dress, a coat, a tablecloth, or something else. Stacy did not sit without work and money. Meanwhile, Vivi was studying law at university. How proud her parents were of her success and told their acquaintances about it. For the eldest daughter, they were calm, hard-working Stacy will not be lost. But they were really proud of their youngest daughter, Vivi, who was smart and beautiful, and was also studying at university. Stacy was genuinely happy for her sister. What could she do? She herself was not given to gnaw on the granite of science, but she had golden hands, and it was noted by everyone. As time went on, Stacy's friends were getting married, but it didn't seem to be working out for her. She wasn't attracted to the guys she liked, and for some reason the guys Stacy liked preferred other girls. When she heard about her friends' and classmates' weddings, Stacy worried that she might end up alone, an old maid. Her parents only added fuel to the fire, asking each time their eldest daughter arrived, when will she get married? When children? When will you settle down? Vivi's parents were in no hurry to get married. For one thing, she was the youngest daughter. As long as her older sister didn't get married, Vivi didn't have to worry about it. Secondly, she was still in school, and after graduation she was going to go to graduate school. Her parents saw her in their dreams as a university teacher or even a professor. From the eldest, Stacy, they just expected human happiness, to meet a cheerful, good-natured husband, to have favorite grandchildren. Stacy was almost desperate. She looked at every guy in her neighborhood as a potential spouse and evaluated young people only from this position. Of course, such obsession did not go unnoticed and scared men away. Once there was a dance at the House of Culture. Stacy went there with her friends. She didn't like dancing very much, and loud music gave her a headache. But you could meet someone at the dance. Galia, her friend, found a husband there. They were living together now, expecting their first child. Stacy wanted the same, the love of a husband, a child, simple human happiness. She put on her best dress, tight, short, revealing her slender legs, curled her hair into curls, painted her eyelashes and lips. After looking at herself in the mirror and being satisfied, she slipped out of the house. Stacy didn't have much hope for anything, because she went to the dance once every 2 or 3 months and always came back with nothing. But that night was different, magical, amazing. Jacob had noticed one of Stacy's friends, Penelope, a blue-eyed beauty. He approached their company, seemed to be getting to know everyone, but kept his eyes on Penelope. Stacy realized she was missing. When she saw the stranger's turquoise eyes, merry, mischievous, and sly, and his smile that would drive anyone crazy, she fell in love. Jacob was witty and fun to talk to. He felt confident, not embarrassed, unlike so many of the other guys in Stacy's company. And she herself, of course, was mesmerized by him. Stacy envied Penelope. She wished that this young man was looking so interested in her and not her friend. She would have given a lot for that. But Jacob asked Penelope one dance, then another. Stacy watched them enviously from a distance. She saw the boy try several times to hold Penelope tighter to him than was proper. His hands kept slipping below her waist. Penelope, embarrassed, tried to pull away. Stacy didn't understand her. What was all this modesty and childish behavior? They were adults. They had already graduated. They were working. After another dance, Penelope slipped outside for some fresh air. Stacy understood that. She had been frightened by her beau's pressure, so she'd found an excuse to run away. Stacy had been watching the couple all evening and could see what was going on. Jacob hurried after his lady, but Stacy got in his way. Slow music was playing. "Shall we dance?" Stacy smiled at the boy. It was a desperate and bold move. Stacy had never acted like this before, but now it was as if someone was leading her by the hand. The girl suddenly felt relaxed, confident. There was no doubt in her mind that Jacob would agree to dance with her. And so he did. He stared at Stacy for a moment, as if trying to remember who she was. But of course, Jacob had only been looking at Penelope when he met her. He didn't care about the others, but the next second he was smiling radiantly at Stacy, making her heart race and her palms sweat. and he held out his hand to her. They danced in each other's arms. Stacy melted in his warm embrace. When the music stopped, he even kissed the girl. Of course, it wasn't the first kiss in Stacy's life, but she had never had that reaction before. Stacy felt dizzy and her eyes darkened. She wished Jacob could hold her like this for the rest of her life. She didn't care if he kissed and hugged her in front of everyone. Let them watch, let them be jealous. And she didn't care what or who thought of her. "Why don't we go for a walk?" Jacob suggested in a slightly husky voice. Stacy was all for it. She wanted to be alone with him too. They walked through the city at night, holding hands. Jacob said something about himself, then asked Stacy questions about her life. When he learned that she lived alone, he offered to go to her. Stacy agreed without hesitation. In the evening and at night, Stacy played a very pleasant role for herself. She imagined that she and Jacob were husband and wife who loved each other and were going to live together for the rest of their lives. It was a pleasure to be near this man, to take care of him. How happy was it to fall asleep next to the one she loved? Jacob was already asleep, but Stacy lay there, staring at the ceiling, savoring the warmth of a loved one. His peaceful breathing, the silence, the stillness. Just the two of them. Magical. Stacy realized she was in love like she had never been in her life. She never knew she was capable of such feelings. Stacy didn't know much about Jacob. He told her he lived in another city. Which city, he didn't mention. He'd tell her tomorrow. Guy came here to visit a friend. They were in the army together. This coworker had a wedding recently, so he invited Jacob. Witnesses like Jacob's leaving soon. But now everything's changed. They've met each other. Jacob isn't going anywhere, and if he does, he'll probably take her with him. The way he'd been looking at her all night. Those looks were the spark that had ignited between them, and that rarely happens. How lucky they were to meet each other at the dance. In the morning, Stacy woke up to someone rattling pans in the kitchen, but caught the scent of scrambled eggs. Stacy stretched in bed and smiled, remembering the events of the previous evening. It's Jacob. He's making them breakfast. How wonderful and romantic this is. Before meeting her lover, Stacy peeked into the bathroom. She washed her face, lightly brushed her hair to look casual, touched up her lipstick and lightly pinched her cheeks, causing a blush. She wanted to look her best in front of Jacob. He'd made her scrambled eggs, and there was ham frying in the skillet. "Good morning," he smiled. "I've been tending to your place for a while. Nothing, I was just hungry." "It's for the best." Stacy smiled radiantly. Breakfast almost in bed. How romantic. "Why don't you come on? I'll take care of you." Jacob took out a plate, deftly placed a piece of scrambled egg on it, and sprinkled greens on top. Stacy watched his every move as if mesmerized. Her heart beat joyfully in her chest. She had finally met her man. And what a man. Beautiful, intelligent, attentive, caring. They ate breakfast in silence. Jacob seemed pensive. He was obviously thinking about something, and Stacy didn't want to distract him. "Thank you for tonight," he finally broke the silence. "I have to go. I have to stop by Layton's, pack my things, and get to the train station. The train's coming." Stacy felt like she'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. How come? Is he leaving already? What about her? I mean, they're so happy, so cozy together. "Are you leaving already?" she asked in a distressed voice. "Didn't I tell you?" Jacob was surprised. Then he smiled his charming smile. "Yeah, well, we didn't have much to talk about last night." "I thought you were staying," Stacy admitted. "I would have." "You're great, aren't you? But the train's in 3 hours and there's a lot to do. We'll see each other again." Stacy struggled to keep the tears from coming to her eyes. She'd already figured it out from Jacob's look and his tone. It was an illusion, their feelings and sparks. The situation that Stacy and Jacob found themselves in was fairly typical and common. They obviously had different expectations for this encounter. For Jacob, it was an easy one-night adventure with no commitment. He was honest and didn't intentionally deceive Stacy. He just didn't specify all the details because of the romantic atmosphere. On the other hand, Stacy fell in love very quickly and began to build illusions about a serious relationship and a future together. She herself invented a beautiful love story, although Jacob did not promise anything like that. When the truth came out, it was a painful disappointment for Stacy. But she'd done the right thing, not to make a scene, but to keep her dignity. Jacob had been good in his own way too, apologizing, explaining the situation, and not making empty promises. In this kind of casual romance, it is important to be sober about the situation and the expectations of both parties. Avoid naive illusions and do not build air castles. But if feelings have awakened, do not be ashamed of them or suppress them. The main thing is to maintain respect for yourself and your partner. Accept the situation as it is. Extract from it a positive experience, not bitterness of resentment. Life goes on, and new love adventures and meetings may be waiting ahead. The situation Stacy finds herself in is indeed a difficult one. An unexpected pregnancy after a casual liaison puts before her a difficult choice, on which her whole future life depends. On the one hand, she dreams of motherhood, and at her age this may be her last chance to have a child, plus a child from a man for whom she had warm feelings. Igor has shown himself to be an attentive and caring man, albeit for a short time. On the other hand, Jacob is clearly not expecting and not ready for fatherhood after a fleeting affair. Raising a child alone will be very difficult, both morally and financially, and the pregnancy itself in her position a great stress. To make a decision on abortion is also not easy. In addition to ethical worries, it can negatively affect health and further fertility. In such a situation, it is very important to soberly consider all options, listen to your heart, but also objectively assess your strength and capabilities. Consult with close people who can support. And having made a decision, do not torture yourself with doubts and guilt. No matter how difficult the situation may be, life goes on. Perhaps in the future Stacy will have the opportunity to become a mother under more favorable circumstances. Or maybe this experience will help her better understand her true desires and priorities. The main thing is to move forward, drawing strength from her informed choices. Stacy had never met one before at all. She couldn't think of a better candidate for fatherhood. No, of course, Jacob won't be involved in the baby's life. He wouldn't even know he existed. No way. They'll never meet again. And yet, such a heredity. If the baby turns out to be as beautiful, it's a dream come true. Stacy felt she couldn't get rid of the baby, even with the hardships that threatened her. The fate of a single mother is unenviable, but it's better than being all alone. Having no children at all is even worse. In general, Stacy hesitated for a while and then made a difficult decision for herself. She leaves the child and will try her best to give the baby a good childhood. She has a profession. Parents, in case of anything, will definitely help. They are loving, reliable. So the baby will be. The decision has been made. Stacy felt inner peace and began, at last, to really enjoy the life, rapidly developing under her heart. At this time, Vivi, the younger sister, had finished graduate school and received her degree. Not only that, she was invited to work overseas for a large company doing research. This was something incredible in Stacy's eyes. Vivi, her little sister, had made it to such heights. A dizzying career, interesting work, recognition awaited her. And she, Stacy, would soon be a single mom. Her parents talked of their youngest daughter's impending departure. They were proud of her, proud of Vivi again, and had no idea that their eldest daughter would soon make them happy that she was about to become a single mom. Against the backdrop of her sister's success, for which Stacy was certainly very happy, her own life seemed a complete failure. Vivi drove away. She called her parents and sister, occasionally sending letters with pictures in them. Vivi had changed. There was a hardness in her face that made the girl even more beautiful and attractive. Beautiful, smart, just a dream. And Stacy had her own life going on. A few months passed, and it was impossible to hide the pregnancy. At work, they figured it out. The boss wasn't particularly happy that one of his seamstresses was going on maternity leave. Now he was nagging Stacy about her work and kept insinuating that she wouldn't be welcome at work because a single mom would be taking sick leave all the time. Who would have to work then? All of this was unsettling to Stacy. She understood that the case is going to be dismissed because the labor code carefully protects pregnant employees. But there are always loopholes, so the boss found one. One day he simply closed the attire, terminating its existence. Accordingly, all female employees lost their jobs, but only for one day, because the firm went bankrupt only on paper. In fact, it continued to function without stopping. The very next day, the boss took the dressmakers back to their old jobs. All except Stacy. A pregnant employee and then a single mom with a small child were of no use to the boss. Stacy was out of work and destitute. She had no savings. She couldn't even pay her rent. Nowhere to go. Stacy had to go back to her parents in the village and confess everything to them. Her mother and father were surprised to hear her daughter's story, but not particularly upset, even seemingly on the contrary. "Do not worry, we'll get through," her father soothed, stroking Stacy's head like a little girl. "We won't fall through. It's not those times. We'll be fine," echoed the mother. "You have a baby, we'll help raise it. Children are happiness." Her parents didn't seem bothered by the difficulties ahead or the inevitable gossip from the neighbors. Stacy understood why this was the case. They had a successful youngest daughter. Even Stacy's life mistakes paled in comparison to Vivi's accomplishments. On the one hand, it made life easier for the mother to be, but on the other hand, it made her feel even more ridiculous and stupid. As always, against Vivi's background, Stacy was losing badly. Frustrating, painful, but familiar. At the due date, Stacy's son Ben was born. The new mother spent hours looking at his red, wrinkled face, trying to see if he looked like Jacob. She wanted him to look like his father, to be as handsome, as charming, as charismatic. It didn't work. Ben didn't have those deep birch eyes or the open smile that made his cheeks dimple. Ben was just an ordinary boy, short, skinny, black-haired, like his grandfather. Stacy was a little hurt that her son hadn't inherited his father's good looks, but it didn't affect her feelings for the little boy in any way. Stacy adored Ben. The first time she saw her baby, she realized that from now on all her actions, all her life would be only for his sake, for the sake of this little man. While Ben was a baby, Stacy was supported by her parents. How could they not? Government payments are minimal, no husband, no savings, no job in sight. Who wants an employee with a baby in her arms? So the parents fed both their daughter and their adored grandchild. Stacy didn't want to be on their backs, so as soon as the opportunity arose, she took a job as a farm laborer. Ben was too young for kindergarten. He was left in the care of his grandparents. They were very fond of him. But Stacy decided to work. After all, her baby needed the best toys, the best clothes, the best travel. She accepted that Ben was growing up without a father, but the boy should not be in need because of his own mother's carelessness. The work was hard and physically exhausting. To make a good living, she had to work double shifts, but at least Stacy had money. Now she went into town with Ben every weekend. They sat in cafes, went on rides, went to the movies, and of course visited toy stores. Stacy often let her son choose what he wanted: expensive radio-controlled cars, imported construction equipment, huge sets of soldiers. Stacy literally bent over backwards at work for this, but most importantly, the happy gleam in her only child's eyes. "Why do you shake your head sometimes?" Dad asked. "You can't do that. Everything is for Ben. You forget about yourself. And you're still young." I don't want anything, Stacy shrugged. I just want my son to be happy. Son, it's time you taught him to work, teased his father. He doesn't clean up his plate or his room. The grandmother objected. You do everything for him. Spoiled the boy. It's not good for him. It's not good for a man. No, Stacy's mother intervened. A loving grandmother will still have time to teach him to work. Let him enjoy his childhood for now. Stacy fully shared her mother's opinion and supported her. Her father just waved his hand at the women's arguments and silently went outside. Sometimes he would say something like, "Can't you argue with me?" Stacy was annoyed by her father's behavior at the time. It wasn't until a decade later that she realized how right he was. Blinded by her love for her only son, Stacy hadn't seen or noticed much. Now they're reaping the rewards. Ben grew up a bright but lazy boy. At school, he'd grasped everything quickly at first and was an excellent student without much difficulty. Stacy hoped he'd taken after his Aunt Vivi. She already held a position in the scientific academy, published in journals, and was almost a celebrity, at least in scientific circles. But it is impossible to ride out all the school years on one cleverness and memory. It was time to work, to teach, to delve into complex formulas, to make an effort. That's what Ben didn't want to do. And the problems began: twos, absences, unwillingness to go to this stupid school at all. Ben gave a lot of arguments for the fact that in the modern world a person can get a good job without education. And Stacy's heart was bleeding from the fact that her son was wasting his abilities in such a stupid and talentless way. The strict grandfather tried to educate his stubborn grandson. This time the mother and grandmother did not interfere with him, kept aside. But it was too late. For Ben, there were no more authorities. The boy got mixed up with a bad bunch of teenagers from dysfunctional families. Stacy talked to her son a lot, tried to call him to order, but it was all in vain. Ben was convinced that he knew best how to behave. "But what can you teach me?" he questioned his mother. "You live in poverty. You have no education. All your life you worked on the farm for pennies. Your parents should have brought you up. By example, you know." "I don't want a life like yours," Ben said to Stacy's mother. "Your example wasn't a good one. There are other ways." Stacy had nothing to say to her rapidly growing son. All she could do was hope that he would be all right, that he would grow up and wise up. The year Ben was to graduate from high school, Stacy experienced many losses. First, just after New Year's Eve, her father passed away. He'd long had a strange cough and difficulty breathing, but he'd written it off as a lifelong smoker. It turned out to be his heart. The heart attack happened in the morning. The ambulance didn't even make it to the hospital. After his grandfather's death, Ben went wild. The man, though elderly, had kept him in check. Now it's like he's got no brakes. He could disappear nights with new friends, come home drunk and demand money from his mother and grandmother for entertainment. Ben became rude, abrasive, a total stranger. Neither persuasion nor threats worked on him. Stacy, who was still longing for her father, felt she was losing her son. And only his mother gave her hope with her words that the boy was mad because he was growing up at that age, without a father. "The boy is difficult, nothing to him. He will soon calm down." "I have seen a lot of such cases in my life," said the grandmother. And indeed, by the middle of the year, Ben had suddenly grown up sharply. He had just graduated from high school, had received his certificate with C's, and he had received his grades only for his past merits, and that was thanks to his mother, who at the end of the year ran after the teachers and the school administration with gifts. Ben seemed to appreciate that his mother and grandmother had done a lot for him, and even apologized to them. Stacy's heart sang with joy. Mom had been right. Growing up, Ben changed. "I decided to go to City College to be a welder. It's a great trade," he announced. His mother and grandmother approved of his choice. They would have been happy with any decision Ben made. The main thing was that the boy realized the importance of education. Ben would learn, he would get a profession, he would have a good, settled life. He left without difficulty, went to college, started an independent life in a college dormitory. Stacy breathed a sigh of relief. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then another blow hit. On New Year's Eve, the elderly Vivi fell ill. Fever, cough. No big deal, just the usual seasonal cold. Stacy nursed her back to health, but her grandmother got worse and worse. They called the doctor. He immediately heard wheezing in her lungs. Vivi was admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of bilateral pneumonia. Stacy was scared, of course, but pneumonia is a serious thing. Only Grandma is in the hospital, under the care of doctors. Stacy didn't think anything bad, but one morning she got a call from the hospital with the terrible news that Vivi was gone. During the night, the seizures began. In just 1 year, Stacy had lost both parents, her support, her reliable rear end. It seemed to her that she had been knocked out from under her feet. She was left alone with this cruel world, with a complicated life and a difficult teenager Ben. How she wished now that Jacob, the father of her child, was there. Yes, she still remembered him fondly and lovingly. Stacy needed a solid shoulder to lean on in this difficult situation. But there was no such person, there just wasn't. Vivi was far away. Sure, she would come for a while to say goodbye to her mom. But she'd go straight back to her vibrant, eventful life. And Jacob, of course, wouldn't remember Stacy anymore. I wonder how his life turned out. Surely he is happily married, raising his children, not even realizing that somewhere there is another son, so in need of attention and care. Time passed. Stacy was adjusting to her new life. The son went to study in the city. The woman still worked double shifts to make sure Ben had everything he needed. Ben needed clothes, food, textbooks, and extra classes. The young man still needed to go out and have fun after all. It is the time of college, when, if not now. And life in the city is not cheap. Her son wasn't working yet, so Stacy did her best for her only child, bending her back and transferring most of her paycheck to Ben. Doesn't she need much? But for Ben, whose life was just beginning, Stacy wanted to provide everything he needed. If you brought a man into this world, you'd better provide for him. It was oddly dreary to be in an empty house. No one to discuss the news of the day with. Ben, of course, was called almost every night. He answered his mother's questions that he was fine, always in a hurry. It was understandable, being young. Stacy took no offense, but she often felt lonely and abandoned. Edward, a former classmate who was already a widower, began courting Stacy during this period of her life. He worked as a driver for the administration. Once upon a time, Edward had chased Stacy with flowers and compliments. It was back in high school. Funny, Stacy recalled, insecure, ridiculous, kind of anxious, but touching. Back then, young Stacy had dreamed of guys like Jacob, handsome, stylish, smart. And Edward, he was too plain, ethereal, puny, and wearing glasses. Of course, Stacy was pleased by the boy's attention. It flattered her ego, to be sure. But anything serious with him was out of the question. Time passed. Edward had grown from a teenager into a rather attractive man. He married a girl a grade below him, Trixie, whom Stacy had been friends with as a child. They weren't close friends, but they often hung out together, talking, sharing secrets. Edward and Trixie's family was exemplary. They were both quiet, hardworking, polite. It was hard to imagine either of them raising their voices at their spouse or children. Stacy was happy for her childhood friends. Edward and Trixie had a son and a daughter. They raised their children, worked, flew to the sea every summer. Full house, affluence, love, prosperity. Stacy looked at this happy couple with a smile, and was happy for them, and a little envious. That was the kind of family she wanted to have, preferably with Jacob. But it hadn't worked out. Except that Edward and Trixie's happiness had been short-lived. Young and seemingly healthy Trixie suddenly began to wither. She was literally melting away. She became thin, weak. Edward took his wife to hospitals trying to help her. The cause, of course, was found some complex genetic disease had debuted, but the doctors just threw up their hands and gave disappointing prognosis. There was no help. As a result, Edward was left alone with 2 children in his arms. True, his son and daughter were already old enough, but still the whole village supported the inconsolable widower. Stacy even cooked dinners for the orphan family. And then the man pulled himself together and took care of the household himself. So slowly he raised the children, put them on their feet, educated them. Both of them were already working and living in the city. Edward was in no hurry to move closer to his children. His elderly parents were still in the village, so he looked after them. When Ben left for school, Stacy began to notice that Edward was around more and more often, walking her home after work, chatting about this and that, or helping her carry her bags from the store. It was as if he was accidentally in her way. Stacy didn't mind this pleasant company. They talked about the news, reminisced about their childhood, laughed. One day she invited Edward to tea. He met her after work, as was his custom, and walked her to the gate. The man agreed and came in. Finally, Edward decided to have a serious conversation. It was obvious that he was not taking this step lightly. "Stacy, I've always liked you, you know," he said. "Well, when was that?" Stacy smiled. She hadn't realized what Edward was getting at then. It seemed to her that they were just reminiscing about their childhood again. It had been a long time ago, hadn't it? Edward agreed. Then he looked at her seriously and added, but nothing had changed since then. Stacy looked at the man questioningly. She didn't know what to say. But the sensation of this unexpected confession was clearly pleasant. It sent shivers down her spine and warmed her heart. "I've had a crush on you since I was a kid." Since the 6th grade, Edward continued. "I decided to admit it in high school. And then I backed off. I pretended I didn't care, but I didn't, and I didn't. And the truth is, I was in a lot of pain. I used to sneak looks at you, admire you. I'd get jealous if any of the guys were around. And I dreamed that when I graduated from high school, I'd get rich and come after you in a cool car. Then you'd pay attention to me." Stacy smiled. The confession seemed naive and sweet. She hadn't noticed anything. Edward smiled too, remembering his young, ambitious self. "But it didn't work out," the man continued. "I couldn't get into university. I didn't have enough brains. I studied to be a driver and returned to the village. Of course, I found out about you. Some acquaintances told me you lived in the city. They said you had someone. Well, I didn't doubt it. Such a beauty. How could you not have fans lining up? I bet they did." Stacy couldn't take it anymore and laughed out loud. "Edward, living here in the village, thought I was a horde of suitors. I was lonely and jealous of my married friends. Oh, you don't know how wrong you were." "Yes, I was a young fool." Edward grinned. "Anyway, I decided that the train had finally left. Edward, you were under the illusion that I had a rich fiancé in town and tons of admirers. In reality, I was lonely and jealous of my married friends. You're in town, and you have a rich fiancé who lavishes you with gifts," Edward said bitterly. "I should have checked, and I suffered and felt my own inadequacy. Who was I? Just a driver. And you're a princess? A queen, an unattainable ideal. No match for me." Edward was in almost physical pain at the time. The girl he had been in love with since childhood would never be his. At the time, it seemed like there was nothing to live for. The guy worked and ate, went out with friends. The world was somehow gray and faded. Everything seemed meaningless. And then it suddenly became clear that the neighbor's daughter Trixie was attracted to him, to Edward. It was an amazing discovery for the boy. Someone could love him for who he was, not too pretty, not too successful. Anya had gone from a skinny girl to a lovely young woman. Big clear eyes, thick long hair, thin waist. Trixie graduated from a teacher's college in the city and returned to her hometown. She was now teaching school, tutoring first graders. She walked briskly toward Edward that evening, returning from work. She caught up with her neighbor at the gate and told him to his face how she felt. "I was stunned," Edward recalled with a smile. "It was unexpected, and I felt sorry for her. I'd been in the same position myself. I knew how hopeful she was, how important my attention was to her. And I knew how much my indifference would throw her off. How could I do that to a fragile girl in love?" Anyway, Edward and Trixie started dating, getting to know each other better and realizing every day that they were a great couple. "I thought nothing good was going to happen in my life," Edward said. "It was as if Trixie had pulled me out of my cocoon, showing me that happiness was still possible." Edward and Trixie married and had children. "And then? Then you came back to the village, confused and pregnant," Edward said to Stacy. "How I wanted to be there for you, to support you. But it was too late. We were married, and we had babies. Did you still love me then?" Stacy wondered. "Of course I did," Edward answered. "I still do. But I couldn't show my feelings then. I already had obligations to Trixie and the children. I loved all three of them very much, and I couldn't betray my family, not even for my own happiness." "Were you unhappy?" Stacy asked in surprise. Edward's revelations had shaken her to the core. "I couldn't say. Trixie was wonderful. I loved her in my own way, took care of her. I was good to her. But with you, even now, I can't describe how I felt and how I feel." They sat for a while longer. Edward stared at Stacy, waiting for some sign from her. She didn't understand her own feelings. She was pleased that there was someone who loved her so much. It made her feel warm. After the death of her parents, Stacy was left all alone, a son in town, a sister abroad. There were no people who cared about her, who tried to please her, who were interested in her well-being. And then there was Edward. In love, devoted, good, reliable. But something was stopping Stacy, Ben. How would he feel about this turn of events? He'd probably disapprove, say her mother had gone crazy and was having an affair in her old age. Only the desire to be with someone she cared about gradually overcame her doubts. Stacy often thought about how nice it would be if they lived together. Edward would be happy, that was for sure. And it felt good to know that you could make someone so happy. Anyway, that night, the former classmates decided to try to become a couple. "I'll ask you out tomorrow," Edward summarized with a smile. "The dream of my youth would finally come true." "It will come true." Stacy nodded like Trixie's wife. The next day they went into town. They wandered through the park, talking, sitting in cafes, and then they went to a movie theater. Edward took Stacy's hand during the movie and held it for an hour and a half until the movie was over. The woman didn't mind, she liked the feeling. She was finally not alone. A week later, Edward moved in with her. He fixed the leaky faucet and tightened the hinges on all the interior doors. They were finally squeak-free. And Stacy started cooking for herself again. She was too lazy to do it alone, but now Edward was with her, and she was making him happy with delicious meals. The only question on Stacy's mind was how Ben would feel about all this. He didn't know yet, did he? His son rarely came to visit his mother, and they talked on the phone more and more. She had been stalling, not telling Ben about the changes in her life. Edward had told both his son and daughter at once. Stacy realized they were happy for their father. She wished her own son would react the same way, but there was little hope of that. Several years passed. Stacy still hadn't decided to have a serious conversation with her son. Hiding the details of her personal life wasn't difficult. The son had little interest in what was going on with his mother. He usually only called to ask for money. But one day, Ben came to visit. It was surprising. The son hadn't graced his mother with his presence for a long time, and now he showed up. Hi, Stacy was both excited and a little confused. Edward hadn't come home from work yet, but his things were everywhere. It was impossible to ignore the fact that someone else was living in the house now. Hi, Ben said glumly. He didn't look well, gaunt, pale, anxious. I need money, he said. Stacy knew right away that something serious had happened. What's going on? She asked, clutching at her heart. Something stabbed in her chest. Is it something with school? I haven't studied in a long time, Ben muttered under his breath. How come? They expelled me for truancy. I've been working hard and you don't get any money, he said rudely. I sent you most of your paycheck every month, Stacy reminded him. That's good money for the city. It's nothing, Ben sighed. I didn't have enough. So I did the best I could. Other people's parents are well-to-do. They have cars and apartments and money for fun. Did I feel like a beggar all the time? You think that's nice? It hurt Stacy to hear those words. She'd worked her whole life for her son. She wanted Ben to have the best of everything. And now this is what happens. He thinks he's miserable. So Stacy's not doing her job as a parent. Ben even dropped out of college. So what now? Stacy asked. Did he go into debt? I wanted to start a business, make some money, Ben explained. I ended up in debt. They're charging me a lot of money. They're threatening to kill me. Where am I going to get it? So I came to you for help, Mom. You know, I ain't got nothing. What do you mean you don't have anything? Ben was surprised. What about the house? Do you want us to sell the house? Well, what's the solution, Mom? I'll pay off my debts and rent an apartment. We'll live in the city. Why are you going to take a well-deserved vacation soon? There's no couch in town, of course. But I'll get you a job in an attire. My grandmother told me that you used to be a seamstress, and now this labor pays well. We'll live together in town, like we used to. Wouldn't that be nice? Stacy couldn't agree with her son. A couple of years ago, she would have happily supported Ben's idea. Living alone in an empty house was unbearable. But now she had Edward. They were good together. It was nice to have someone who loved and understood. And now what? Ben finally noticed the men's things in the rooms. Edward's jacket hung on the wall, his pants were on the table. There were size 43 sneakers by the front door. What are those? Ben asked, looking at his mother in amazement. Did you have someone in your life? I've been wanting to tell you for a long time, Stacy said. It's just something that happened here. Ben nodded his head understandingly and sighed sadly. My personal life is getting better. Yeah, well, of course you don't have a son to worry about. You know I'm not. Stacy objected softly. She could see that Ben was depressed and in trouble. He needed help, and she, the mother, would certainly lend him her shoulder in his time of need. Who else would? Son, I'll do whatever you say. And Stacy did. She sold the house, gave most of the proceeds to her son. With the rest, she bought a tiny apartment in an old house on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Edward offered options, wanted to give Ben his savings. It was less than he needed, but it was still a decent amount. Stacy didn't agree. Edward shouldn't have to solve her problems. Their problems. He had children of his own. Using a man in a situation like this is despicable. Stay with me, Edward asked Stacy. You're packed, your suitcases are waiting for tomorrow morning. Ben has ordered a cab for you by 10 o'clock. You know I can't, Stacy replied. I know, but I don't understand. You gave him money, you bought him a place to live. But why would you want to be there yourself? Stay with me. I've got a big house, plenty of room, you know. We had a good time together, didn't we? We were, agreed Stacy. Yes, in the few years she'd lived with Edward, the woman had grown accustomed to warmth, to caring, to understanding. It was very pleasant. They walked together in the evenings, discussing things. Edward looked at Stacy with loving eyes, and she felt happy. But now everything was different. Stacy could see that her son was not well. Too anxious, too restless. Something bad is clearly going on in his life. Yes, Ben is an adult, and Edward is partly right when he says he should be able to deal with his own problems. But when Stacy was in a difficult situation, she didn't deal with her problems on her own. Stacy's parents had helped her a lot in the past. Edward assured her that this was a different story. A young, single woman with a baby in her arms and a grown man who'd been given money from the sale of her house by her mother. Stacy couldn't agree with him. It's fine for him to talk. He's got both his son and his daughter graduated, working good jobs, with families. There was no telling how Edward would behave if one of his children was in a situation like Ben's. Stacy was also afraid of losing her last place to live. Now that she didn't have the house she'd spent her childhood in, she was beginning to worry about growing old. It wouldn't be long before she would be elderly and possibly helpless. What would she do without a corner of her own if Ben could not be looked after? He's going to lose that apartment in the old building too. And we need to find out what's going on in his life. Maybe we should save his son. It's about time. He's not going to admit it himself. But when they start living together, Stacy will realize it, see it for herself. She can't leave her only child alone with his troubles and problems. Why are you so worried? Stacy smiled at Edward. It was a sad smile. The woman understood, even without the mirror. I'm not moving to the moon or even to another continent. The city's close by. Distance is no barrier to feelings. Shall we meet, socialize? Of course, Edward sighed. But it's not the same thing, you know, it's just the way life works. Stacy moved to LA and was eager to get settled into her new place. There was only one room in the apartment. It went to Ben, of course. Stacy took the kitchen. She bought herself a cot, which she put by the window at night and put away in the closet in the morning. Edward came often at first. They walked along the promenade, as they had before, and sat in cafes. With him, Stacy felt invaluable, important, loved, not like at home. Edward had urged her to move in with him. But if you don't want to move in with me, let's go somewhere else, he suggested. Svetlana moved to the city to be near her son Matvey and to help him. She soon discovered that Matvey had a serious problem with alcoholism. He was drinking a lot, coming home late at night or in the morning. At first, Svetlana was very worried about her son, afraid that something would happen to him because of his drinking. But then she got used to his nocturnal strolls. Svetlana began to take care of the drunk Matvey. In the morning, she brought pills, water, cleaned up after him. Matvey's alcoholism progressed. He degenerated, became stupid, aggressive, helpless. Svetlana blamed herself for her son's problems, believing that the absence of a father and Matvey's unknown origin had an impact. She speculated that Matvey's alcoholism could have been passed on genetically. Svetlana fully supported and served her son. She cooked, cleaned, and bought groceries. Matvey did not work anywhere because of his drinking and lived on his mother's full support. In general, a difficult situation is described when an elderly mother is forced to have full custody of her adult alcoholic son, having given up her personal life. The son degenerates, but the mother cannot abandon him. Ben didn't bother to work. After a while, the son started demanding money from Stacy when he didn't have enough to drink. And this happened quite often, because the man earned a living by rare casual earnings which fell out infrequently. His soul demanded alcohol on a regular basis. Stacy, feeling sorry for her son, at first gave him money for pocket money and then tried to stop giving money. But Ben still took money from his relative. Sometimes he quietly took money out of his mother's purse. Sometimes he got his way with threats and rudeness. Stacy felt miserable and confused. Living with her own son had become a nightmare. Ben would yell at his mother, sass her for no reason. He would take her money. Therefore, the woman tried, having received a payment, to immediately make a stock of food for a long time. The adult son has not yet raised his hand on his elderly parent. But looking into Ben's empty, embittered eyes, Stacy realized that the moment was not far off. The only outlet for Stacy was her walks with Edward. He still visited her in town whenever he could. The woman didn't talk about her life. It was embarrassing hard. She couldn't share this misery with anyone at all. In front of others, Stacy put on the mask of a prosperous and happy woman. One day Edward told Stacy news that made her heart ache. "I'm moving soon," he said, looking away. "We won't be able to see each other much." Whereto Stacy sighed sadly. The only person she'd felt human lately was Edward, and now it looked like their meetings were about to end. "To the sea, to Nashville," he answered. "With his son's family. You know, I'm having trouble with my lungs. The doctor told me to change the climate or else. But never mind, my son has decided to move with me. My daughter's still thinking about it. But it looks like she's going to do it too. So that's that." "That's too bad," Stacy said sadly. She tried to fight the tears that had come to her eyes. "Stacy, I'm begging you, please come with me. You helped your son solve problems when he was in a difficult situation. He'll figure it out on his own. He's not a little boy anymore, are you? We'll live by the sea." Imagine how happy that would be. "Think about it," Edward said. Stacy realized she wasn't going anywhere. How would she leave Ben? Edward just didn't know anything about Ben's addiction. He didn't know that he hadn't been making any money for a long time. Without his mother, Ben would be lost, completely lost. And how could she enjoy the sea, the sun, and the company of a loving Edward, knowing that her son is dying alone in a distant city? Edward was gone. Stacy took his absence hard. They called each other, texted each other. Of course, Edward sent pictures of beautiful landscapes and beckoned, still calling Stacy, telling her how good it would be together. But the woman felt responsible for the son she'd given birth to, the one she hadn't raised. So she had to be there for him, to help, to support him. Sometimes because of these thoughts the woman felt terrible, but she could not do anything about it. A few more years passed. Stacy had grown old. She probably could have looked better and younger, but not with this life. Ben continued to drink and adamantly refused treatment. He started taking company home, and it was much harder than when Stacy waited nights for her son. These marginal-looking people, women, put-down men, laughed loudly in Ben's room. Drinking, arguing, even fighting sometimes. When Stacy tried to talk some sense into her son, he snapped at her. He stopped seeing his mother as a person at all. And then Kate, Ben's common-law wife, showed up at the apartment. There was no hope that she would have a positive effect on her son. Kate was a drinker herself. While Ben usually didn't touch his mother except when he needed money, Kate clung to her mother-in-law on and off. Eventually, she and Ben had managed to turn Stacy against her. He was now convinced that his mother intended to break him up with his beloved and hated Kate. Scolding, quarrels, scandals, all this now waited for Stacy every day. And she hadn't saved her son. She hadn't built a personal happiness with Edward. She could be living with a man who'd loved her all her life on the beach. Dreams, that's all. What about Ben, without her supervision? No, she gave a man life, so she must be responsible for him. Well, I guess that's her fate now. The rain had eased off considerably. Stacy took advantage of the respite to make her way to the driveway. This time she was in a hurry, in case it rained again. She was delaying her return, too, because there was nowhere else to go. It looked like Kate and Ben were having company again tonight. We'd be out till morning in the only room they had. They'll be in the kitchen, of course, going to the fridge. Stacy just filled it with groceries. That's a good thing. We'll probably have to go to the store again tomorrow, if there's any money left. Stacy would lie on her cot all night, pretending to sleep, listening to the sounds of the party in the next room. Her main task now is not to disturb her son, Kate, and their guests. Going up to her floor on foot, there had never been an elevator in this old house. The elderly woman stopped. All the doors is dug in. On the landing stood her suitcases, the same one she had moved here from the village with. Stacy opened one of them. Her belongings lay there. Nothing made sense. The woman tried to open the door with her key. It didn't work. Someone had clicked the lock so it wouldn't unlock from the outside. So Stacy knocked loudly. Their bell hadn't worked in a long time. The door swung open. A happy Kate stood on the doorstep, hands at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart. She was smiling strangely. "What's the matter?" Stacy asked. "Seriously, you old hag," Kate said in a luscious voice. "This is my apartment. Why on earth would I leave? It's not yours, it's Ben's. It's in his name. I saw the paperwork myself the other day. You're nobody here." "Then get out of here," Stacy said. Ben's head peeked out from behind Kate. "Yeah, that's what we've decided. You need to go. You don't give us a life, you're always giving us advice," Ben said. "You mind your own business. Are you trying to break Kate up with me too? We'd better live separately." "What are you going to live on?" Stacy didn't understand. She'd long ago realized that her son had no warm feelings for her, but he needed his mother at least as a source of funding. "You don't know anything, do you?" Kate smirked. "I'm expecting a baby in a couple months. I've already got sick pay, maternity pay. And then every month for the child will be paid, so we're doing great." Stacy glanced at her sister-in-law's figure. Yes, her belly was showing under the sweater, but Kate had never been particularly slender, so the woman didn't notice anything. That's news to her. Ben and Kate are having a baby. Poor baby. What's it like growing up with parents like that? And will that baby ever survive? Stacy's eyes darkened at the news. The news of the baby eclipsed even the fact that she was being kicked out of her own home. She felt unbearably sorry for this unborn baby, grandson or granddaughter. At the same time, the woman realized that she was unable to save him, to make his life even a little easier. It would be better to deal with her own fate. "So get out of here," Kate smiled again. "Son? But where am I supposed to go?" Stacy turned to Ben. "You can't live on the streets. You've got a boyfriend in the village. Go to him." Ben said nonchalantly, "Do you have somewhere else to go?" "I don't understand." Ben didn't know that Edward had moved to another state from where he'd never been interested in his mother's affairs. "And you have a rich sister who won't leave you," Kate added and slammed the door shut. Stacy picked up her suitcases and went outside. What else could she do? There wasn't a single thought in her head about where to go. Edward was far away. Vivi's sister was even farther away. No one wanted her. Lonely, abandoned, now homeless. She must have deserved it somehow. She's ashamed to even tell the people she knows how life turned out. Her own son, for whom Stacy's mother lived, kicked her out of the house. Out of the house. The rain had stopped, but the icy wind had picked up. It burned his cheeks and made his eyes water. It was rapidly getting darker. There were hardly any people on the streets anymore. Stacy was finally exhausted. She set her suitcases down at an empty bus stop, sat on them, and let the tears flow. They poured down her cheeks, and the woman didn't even wipe her face. She wept for her unfulfilled hopes for her son, sobbed for the plight of Ben and her unborn grandson. But their own future, of course, was a source of anxiety and apprehension. Where to go, from whom to ask for help. Staying outdoors on a cold November night was a pleasure, and something would happen. A pleasant young girl's voice came from somewhere behind her. Stacy turned around. A young woman was looking at her. Tall, thin, tight jeans, sneakers, a deep hooded sweatshirt, and eyes. Attentive, sympathetic eyes. Next to the stranger, a small, funny little dog worried, and seemed to look at Stacy with sympathy too. His funny face looked so funny that the older woman couldn't help but smile through her tears. DG was born into a student family. Her mom was an economist, her dad an engineer. The young parents met at a student disco. They noticed each other right away, fell in love, got married. DG was born when both were in their 4th year, each at his own university. The young family was not discouraged. Yes, they didn't earn much yet. Yes, they had to live with their child in a cramped room in the student dormitory. But the couple had so much ahead of them. They dreamed, they planned, they hoped. DG did not remember her parents at all. She saw their photos, listened to the stories of relatives and acquaintances about these people. And then the image of her mother and father opened up in DG's mind. Cheerful, energetic, hardworking, a little naive, loving each other and the child. Tragedy struck at a construction site. DG's mom and dad, trying to earn an extra penny after their studies and main job, were looking for a part-time job. And that time they managed to get a job with a private contractor who was building a sports complex in the city center. The young couple, along with a couple of similar students, were painting the walls, and something happened. Either the cable broke or the platform failed. In general, all 4 of them fell from a height right onto the concrete floor. No one survived. There was no chance. The owner of the construction site managed to get away with it. The students worked for him unofficially. He made it look as if the young people had sneaked into his construction site to take extreme photos or something. A friend of her parents, the family's dormitory neighbor, was babysitting little DG at the time. The girl spent a few days with her. Then she was supposed to be taken to an orphanage. But her father's sister, Aunt Laura, showed up. She lived in the village, raising her 3 children alone. She wasn't poor, but she wasn't wealthy either. Her family couldn't be called a family. An extra mouth in the form of a niece orphaned overnight was a burden to Aunt Laura. But where to go? What would people say? She abandoned her brother's daughter, sent the child to an orphanage. The neighbors will stigmatize her. They'll remember it for the rest of their lives. That's how DG ended up in Aunt Laura's family. The girl's childhood was, at first glance, the most ordinary. DG helped her aunt with the household chores, played outside with her children, and went to school with her friends. But no birthdays with a lot of friends and a cake with candles, no new beautiful dresses, no trips to the amusement park. And no dresses. DG missed the warmth of the world. Hugs, affectionate words, support. Aunt Laura wasn't strict or mean, but she was not in a hurry to surround her niece with love and care. Aunt Laura had a completely different attitude to her own children. She stroked their heads, hugged them, and found tender words for them. DG always felt like a stranger to her aunt. She realized that she grew up with the realization of her own unwantedness, and it was a heavy burden for Aunt Laura. Sometimes DG even felt sorry for her aunt. She was so tired with her work and her own children, and now she had a niece to take care of. DG dreamed of growing up and having a family of her own. There she would be loved and appreciated. She had always spent a lot of time studying. First, she liked to learn new things, and the girl was quite good at it. She was an excellent student all the years. Secondly, DG perfectly understood that education is her only chance for a prosperous life. The girl wanted to leave the village, settle in the city, travel the world. For all this, she needed money. So she did her best. After school, DG entered the university as a translator. She was given a dormitory, and her life of freedom began. Finally, she was no longer a burden to anyone. Digi didn't even pay attention to guys when she was young. She firmly decided for herself, first her career, then everything else. But in her last year of high school, she accidentally met Eugene. He was 8 years older. A well-established, self-confident, handsome, intelligent man came to the university to talk to the rector. Eugene had his own travel agency, and he needed intelligent interpreters. They bumped into each other outside the rector's office. Literally collided. Eugene swung the door open, took a step into the hallway, and crashed into Digi, who was walking by. The man immediately picked the girl up, preventing her from falling, and began to apologize. Digi assured him with a smile that she was fine. She was amused by the man's consternation. He acted as if he hadn't accidentally hit her with his shoulder, but had almost hit her with a car. And then, like a corny scene from a novel, their eyes met, and Digi caught her breath. Eugene seemed to feel something too. There was a spark between the young men. Anyway, they went to the window and talked for a long time. They exchanged phone numbers, of course. And in the evening, he picked up Digi, and they went for a walk around the city. The girl herself chose such a format of the first date. Digi and Eugene's relationship quickly became close and very serious. Soon the girl moved in with him in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in the city center. At first, Digi was frightened and confused by the fact that her chosen one is so rich he has his own travel agency, a beautiful car, an expensive apartment. And what is she? A girl from the village, penniless. She doesn't even have parents. An orphan from Kazan, but Eugene was not embarrassed by all this. He looked at Digi with admiring eyes, showered her with gifts and compliments. The girl saw that her presence made him happy, and finally allowed herself to just be happy and not worry about anything. After a while, Digi realized she was expecting a baby. Confused, of course. It was too quick and unplanned. Eugene, on the other hand, was genuinely happy. His business was booming. The capital was increasing. The business was growing. Children are happiness, the man smiled, stroking Digi's still quite flat belly. Digi had thought that Eugene would finally propose to her after the news of her pregnancy, but he was in no hurry to take her to the registry office. When she herself asked him about it when they would legalize the relationship, Eugene was genuinely surprised. What for? Well, as the child should have a full family, mom, dad. And this child I will recognize legally, do not doubt. And a stamp in the passport, these are such conventions. You know, I was married. And the relationship was ruined after I went to the registry office. Then there was so much trouble with the reissuance of documents and so on. So I'm against such conventions. The words of her beloved then shook Digi, but she coped with herself and accepted Eugene's point of view. Really, does it matter if there is a stamp in the passport? What mattered was that they loved each other. Darcy was born on her due date and made Digi the happiest person on earth. The young mother couldn't get enough of her daughter and couldn't believe where such a miracle had come from. Eugene was not a very attentive father. He had been distant since the birth of the child. Only Digi, blinded by the newfound happiness of motherhood, hadn't noticed it right away. One day, when Darcy was just 2 years old, the man announced, I'm leaving. I'm leaving the apartment to my daughter. I'm going to support her for the rest of her life, and I'm going to keep in touch with the baby too. But I can't live with you anymore. Sorry, I fell out of love, met someone else. It happens. Eugene walked away, leaving Digi feeling upset. She felt like half her heart had been ripped out of her chest. She'd loved Eugene so much, she'd hoped they'd be okay. She had to adjust to the new reality. Eugene hadn't lied, he'd kept his daughter's apartment and was faithfully paying her alimony. But Digi knew she needed to find a source of income. Eugene's money was only for her daughter. Digi needed to work. She needed to establish herself in her profession. As practice had shown, in this life you have to rely only on yourself. Digi realized that, In general, she was still very lucky. Eugene left his daughter an apartment and pays child support. It wasn't much, but it was still money. Still, the pain of the breakup lingered in her chest, and the future looked very dim. I had to get a job. But it so happened that Digi had given birth to a daughter right after the university, so she had no time to get a job. And now, with a small child in her arms and no experience, who needs her? Digi has no relatives, no mom, no sister, no grandmother. No one to look after Darcy while her mother is at work. Send her to daycare. But Darcy would get sick a lot there. An employer wouldn't like an employee who couldn't get enough of sick days. The situation appeared to be a stalemate. That November evening, Digi was contemplating her future. Digi was wondering how she would ever get a job again. Money was tight, and she had to deny herself everything. She couldn't and wouldn't ask Eugene for more money. He had left them a whole apartment and gave them money to support their daughter. And if Digi couldn't provide for herself, that was her problem. After all, she's an adult, not a child. At that moment, Princess Mopisico, the dog Eugene had given to Digi when everything was still good with them, asked to go outside. What bad timing. It's dark and cold, and there are puddles all around. It rained a while ago, but where can we go? Princess can't wait. Darcy is already asleep in her room. She won't wake until morning, so Digi can calmly walk the dog. The girl quickly dressed, attached the collar and leash to Princess and went out into the November evening. Digi noticed the old woman sitting on a suitcase near the bus stop and couldn't believe her eyes. It was too strange. When she got closer, she realized that the old woman was very upset about something. She was crying quietly, not even noticing that her face was already wet with tears. Digi's heart squeezed with pity for a stranger who was obviously in great distress. "What's wrong? Do you need help?" she asked. When Digi heard Stacy's story, she was horrified. She had longed for a mother, for a close family member. She couldn't imagine how Ben could do this to her mom, her own mom. Digi hadn't hesitated for a second in making that offer. The words came out of her mouth before she could think them through. "Let's go to my place now. You're very cold. You need a mug of hot tea. You can't stay outside." A year had passed since that meeting. Stacy had gone to live with Digi. On that cold, dark evening over a cup of hot tea, a solution took shape that suited both parties to the unusual story. Stacy now looked after the house and enjoyed spending time with little Darcy, who loved her new grandmother. Digi went to work knowing that her daughter was in safe and loving hands. Digi finally had someone to love and care for her Stacy. And she was getting the maternal warmth she had missed all her life. And her daughter had a wonderful grandmother who would entertain, feed, and teach. Ben showed up. One day he found out somehow where his mother lived. He demanded Stacy come home, appealed to her sense of family. "Do you value strangers more than your own son?" It happened Stacy shook her head. "I know that now. Sometimes strangers are closer than family. And I'm not strangers with Digi anymore." Ben kicked Kate out. Their baby was never born. Kate, being pregnant, wasn't about to give up her bad habits. Naturally, her body couldn't take it one day. The baby was born prematurely. It was a very weak and sickly boy. He did not survive. The poor baby's parents' plans for a government welfare check fell through. So Ben came crawling back to his mother. He needed her money again. He still didn't want to work. But this time Stacy was firm. No. Edward was right. Her son was a grown man. She'd done more than she could for him. She'd sold her only home so he could buy an apartment in the city and pay off his debts. Let him take it from there. Speaking of Edward, Stacy told him her story after all. She'd gotten over herself. It made her feel better, and Edward finally understood her. He went to Stacy's house, met Digi and Darcy. The four of them had hit it off. It was a nice, warm group of people. Darcy even started calling Edward grandfather. He didn't mind. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy it. Before Edward left, he invited her over. I look forward to seeing all three of you this summer. No refusal. No refusal is planned. Stacy smiled. Edward was gone. Summer is coming. DG and Stacy are making plans for a wonderful vacation in Miami. Edward and his whole family are waiting for them. It's going to be a wonderful vacation. And who knows, maybe they'll move to Florida for the vacation and see what's what. DG will try to get a job and take a vacation and get to know the place. They could do it. Why? Living by the ocean surrounded by people you love and love you. Isn't that happiness? Madison was waiting for her husband to come home from work, cooking dinner. But when she opened the door, she was heartbroken to see me for. Madison was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She was enjoying what she called family time. Madison, when are we having dinner? Looking into the kitchen, asked Richard, the girl's fiancé. A couple more minutes and everything will be ready. Madison smiled. I can't wait, the young man muttered. He sat down at the table and watched the bride's manipulations. If someone had helped me a little, we would have had dinner a long time ago, Madison jokingly told him. What are you implying? Richard was indignant. Nothing, she stroked the young man's hair. I was just saying that if you had helped me in the beginning, everything would have been ready long ago. I'm not just sitting at home, by the way, Richard pouted. I'm developing a cool program that will cost a lot of money. That's why I don't have time to do housework. And that's the kind of thing a girl should be doing. I know, honey, Madison kissed her fiancé on the cheek. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Who the hell is this? Richard asked in surprise. You know I don't have the gift of foresight, she joked. But when she met her fiancé's stern gaze, her playful mood disappeared. I'll get it, Richard said grudgingly and left the table. It so happened that the young man was by nature an introvert, and uninvited guests were like a bone in his throat. When Richard opened the door, he was startled. Standing before him was his cousin Oswald. Richard, hello, he said loudly, entering the flat uninvited. Oswald, Richard asked, confused. Brother, why are you looking at me like that? It's like seeing a ghost, Oswald laughed. Or are you not happy to see me? Of course I am, but... Richard tried to collect his thoughts. What are you doing here? I decided to move to the city, shrugged his shoulders. I'm tired of dealing with my own affairs in the village. I want to find a job here, and then a bride. I see Richard scratched his head. At that moment, the landlady came out into the corridor. When she saw the guest, she smiled broadly. Oswald, what a surprise. Madison hugged the young man. What are you doing here? I decided to move to the city, answered the guest. Oswald, you're just in time. We were just about to have dinner. The girl invited everyone to the table. The evening passed in a relaxed atmosphere. Even Richard, who was not particularly happy about his brother's arrival, got involved in the conversation. Grandpa Travis had caught up with his cow. Oswald finished his story. Yes, as long as I can remember, Grandpa Travis always had adventures, Richard said. On the one hand, I love the country, Madison said dreamily. What's good about it? Richard wondered. There's something romantic about it, she smiled enigmatically. The groom looked at his bride with all his eyes. The young man was a city dweller to the core and never understood the romance of the countryside. Nights under the moon, dew on daisies, evening sunsets near the river. A lot, you know. Madison started listing. Oof, Richard pointed at his fiancée. And meanwhile, Madison is right, supported Oswald girl. You can't find that in the city. All right, brother, it's late, Richard said gruffly. Where are you staying? I'm nowhere. The guest was confused. What do you mean? Richard was taken aback. I thought I'd stay with you for a while. I'm looking for a job. Oswald shrugged his shoulders, so to speak, on a kinship basis. Brother, in your village you can come to visit and stay overnight for a few days, Richard grinned. But in the city you have to give advance notice of your arrival. Where am I supposed to go now? Oswald asked. He was disappointed by his brother's inhospitality. Richard, it's late tonight and Oswald can stay with us, said Madison. And tomorrow morning we will look for a suitable option for him. I have one more question for you. Oswald looked at his brother carefully. When can you pay me back my debt? What debt? The girl was surprised. I borrowed money from Oswald more than a year ago to develop a program, Richard explained in a disgruntled tone. What program? Madison squinted her eyes and stared at her fiancé. Isn't it the super program you're still writing? Yes? Richard nodded his head. I see, Madison said, confused. The girl was discouraged. Richard had initially lied to her, saying that it was a program commissioned by a large company. In fact, it turns out that he borrowed the money from his brother a year ago. Now, there are two questions: where to get the money to pay back the debt and how to live on. The next morning, Richard woke up in a bad mood. The arrival of his brother has disturbed his mental equilibrium. Spoilt relations with his fiancée last night because of Oswald's long tongue. Richard had a fight with Madison. Tell me, why did you have to lie to me about your super program? The girl was indignant. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell the whole truth, Richard justified himself. How are you going to pay back the debt? Madison didn't back down. I'll sell the program and pay it off. When will you sell it? When I write it, Richard snapped. And if that never happens? The girl asked. Thank you very much. The young man bowed to Madison, then grinned and said wryly, I always knew you'd be there for me in a time of need. I'm just realistic about things. The girl looked intently into his eyes. There is a debt to be repaid. I'll pay back the money. Richard got angry. When and why will you pay it back? Why are you bothering me? The young man was indignant. Because I don't want to start my family life with lies and debts, Madison replied. Then no one's keeping you, Richard blurted out. The door is open 24 hours a day. And if you're so mercenary, you're on your own from now on. About the door, I'll think about your offer, especially since it's my flat, she said in a serious tone. And about the separate budget, I agree with you completely. From tomorrow, everyone pays for his own food, utilities, and his own wants. Madison got into bed and turned away from her fiancé. You're welcome, Richard muttered. He was hurt that his fiancé hadn't supported him in his hour of need, but instead had sided with his brother. Memories of last night's quarrel made Richard's mood even worse. Suddenly, a sound from the kitchen alerted the young man. Richard listened. Madison was laughing merrily at Oswald's jokes. This was the last thing he needed. Richard stood up quickly and dressed. What's going on here? Richard stood up quickly and dressed. What's going on here? Madison, who had been laughing, turned away from her fiancé. She silently collected the rest of the breakfast and put it in the fridge. Madison, why did you do that? Oswald wondered. And to feed Richard breakfast. Why is your brother armless? Madison asked snidely. Well, I ran to work, or who will support me? The girl walked past Richard without even looking at him. A couple of minutes later, the young man heard the sound of a door slamming shut. Yes, brother, you've caused me a lot of trouble, Richard accused Oswald. I'm sorry, I didn't know you hadn't told me anything about your fiancée. About your duty, the young man said. I'm sorry, Richard mumbled in reply. Well, that's it, Oswald said, getting up from the table. I'm off. Where are you going? Surprised Richard. Where to? To look for a job? I can't sit on your neck. All right then, Richard rejoiced. The sooner Oswald finds a job, the sooner he'll move out. Good luck to you. After breakfast, Richard sat down to write the program. He switched on the computer, but he still couldn't write a single line. The young man's thoughts kept returning to Madison. No doubt he loved his fiancée, but he was hurt by her lack of confidence in his abilities. Toward evening, Madison and Oswald returned home. The girl immediately went into the kitchen to prepare dinner without even looking at Richard. Why are you two together? Richard asked unhappily. He was tormented by jealousy. I met Madison at the entrance and helped her lift the heavy bags, Oswald explained. By the way, brother, could you pick up your fiancée from work? You would go to the shop together and buy groceries, so that the girl would not carry heavy bags. Oswald suggested. We'll sort it out ourselves, Richard muttered. And why are you always meddling in the wrong business? I was just trying to help. Oswald waved his hands. By the way, I have good news. I found a job at a computer firm. Thank God, Richard rejoiced. But that's not all, smiled the guest. I've made a deal for you, so you'll be starting next week too. As what? Richard was stunned. Who's what? Oswald smiled even wider. Software and hardware engineer. You're a computer scientist, by God. Did I ask you to do that? Richard asked angrily. Why do you always meddle where you are not asked? I just wanted to help, Oswald explained. Go you know where with your help? Shouted Richard. I am so sick of you. Get out of my flat and out of my life, so that my eyes do not see you. At Richard's screams, a frightened Madison ran out of the kitchen. What's going on in here? Asked the girl. I found a job for Richard, and he started. Oswald began to explain the situation, but Richard interrupted him. I told you to stay out of my life. The anger inside Richard just tore him apart. Brother, you'd better calm down before you have a stroke, Oswald advised in a calm tone, which made Richard even angrier. Richard wanted to attack his brother with his fists, but he was stopped by Madison's shout. Calm down quickly. The girl clenched her fists in anger. Richard, have you lost your mind? He started it first, Richard complained, pouting his lips. You should thank your brother for taking care of you. Madison shamed her fiancé, and you're throwing your fists at him. Don't mind your own business, she said in a quiet, commanding tone. All right, now we'll all go to dinner, and afterwards we'll talk and discuss everything. I'm not going to sit at the same table with him, Richard said in a cranky tone. You can stay hungry. Madison shrugged indifferently. It's up to you. Richard had no choice but to accept his fiancée's proposal. The conversation at dinner flowed smoothly. The young men were reluctant to utter words, each thinking about his own. After dinner, all three sat down in the living room. Now, Richard, it's up to you, of course. But today we have utility bills to pay, Madison said sternly. Following your suggestion from yesterday, we'll split everything in half. The girl held out the receipts to her fiancé. Familiarize yourself with what we owe for and how much we owe. All bills must be paid by the 25th, she said. Where will I get the money? Richard was surprised. Your problem. Madison shrugged indifferently. But all payments are due on time. Richard, I'm going to tell you something. Just don't shout, carefully began Oswald. When the young man made sure that his brother listened to him attentively, he continued. What prevents you from combining work and writing a program? Do you think it's easy? Richard was indignant. Not easy, agreed the guest. But with your brains you can do it. At least you believe in me, Richard said with a sneer and looked at his fiancée. Don't look at Madison like a wolf, Oswald advised. Understand she is a young girl, she wants a new dress and lipstick. So let her buy it. Richard shrugged his shoulders. Who forbids her? And with what money did you think? The guest looked at his brother carefully. All her salary goes to your needs, while you're pretending to be a great genius. Richard opened his mouth to object, but didn't make a sound. Damn it, Oswald was right. Madison, why did you put up with me for so long? Richard asked, dumbfounded. Long ago, you should have kicked me to speed up, so that I found a job. Because I love you, the girl replied quietly. Richard walked over to the girl and hugged her tightly. Forgive me, please, whispered the young man. My ambition closed my eyes to reality. That's right, Madison said. Tears sprang from her eyes. Has the armor of ambition and arrogance of a great genius cracked? I swear I'll work hard to make sure you have everything you want, Richard vowed and kissed his bride. And I'll see to it, smiled satisfied Oswald. Happy Madison looked at her guest and whispered, Thank you. 3 months passed. Richard and his brother worked in a computer firm. Oswald moved into a rented flat. Madison and her fiancé's life began to slowly return to normal. One evening after work, the girl waited for her beloved from work. Today she had a surprise for him. Madison was pregnant. The girl was finishing cooking dinner. The doorbell rang. Honey, did you forget your keys? Madison asked, opening the door. But it wasn't her fiancé standing in front of her. Hello, are you Richard's fiancé? Asked a beautiful girl and smiled sweetly. Yes, Madison was confused. I need to have a serious talk with you, the guest replied and entered the flat. About what? The thing is, Richard and I are in love. Madison was speechless at what she heard. How is that possible? Did her Richard have another girlfriend? But how could that be? After all, her fiancé, he loved her every day when he came home from work. He never once gave her any reason to doubt his fidelity. Yes, Richard is no angel, but to live on 2 fronts. Who are you? Madison asked with difficulty. Her throat was sharply dry, and her tongue refused to listen. My name is Chris, the girl replied arrogantly. She looked Madison over from head to toe with an appraising gaze. And I'm Richard's new love. But how can that be? The landlady mumbled in confusion. Her stomach began to ache from the stress she'd been under. But Madison didn't notice it. The only thought in her head was that her fiancé had betrayed her. Why are you surprised? With a cheeky grin, Chris continued to sneer. A man like Richard needs a bright, spectacular, and beautiful woman like me, not someone like you. What's wrong with me? Madison asked quietly. Well, let's just say you're too plain for Richard, Chris replied defiantly. Let's start with your hair. It's a hairstyle that was worn 20 years ago. The color went out of fashion the year before last. The guest shook her head defiantly in defiance. And your clothes are horrible. How can you dislike yourself so much as to stoop to such a thing? Richard never said anything like that. He's always liked everything, the landlady mumbled confusedly. She suddenly realized that she felt a pain in her stomach. She should kick that girl out so Madison could lie down. Once she calms down, her stomach will stop hurting right away. Of course he won't tell you anything, Chris shrugged. You were the most convenient option for him. What are you talking about? Madison, don't be silly, she laughed. You're convenient. You feed the pigeon and put it to bed. What else does a man need to be happy? No, Madison suddenly shouted. You're all lying. Oh, honey, don't be silly. Chris said cynically. You must realize that a man like Richard will sooner or later get tired of living with a bland woman. He'll want exoticism and new emotions. So he switched to me. There was a spark between us as soon as we saw each other. But Richard, as an honest man, for 2 months could not respond to my feelings. But his love for me won out. Shut up, Madison. I know it's unpleasant to hear the truth, but as they say, it's better to know the truth than to live in ignorance. Get out. The pain twisted Madison. It felt like hot metal was being poured into her stomach. What's wrong with you? Chris realized something bad was happening to Madison. The landlady suddenly turned pale and sweat beaded on her face. Call an ambulance. What am I going to tell them? The guest asked in confusion. I'm pregnant. What? Chris looked at her rival in a daze. But Richard didn't tell me anything about the baby. He doesn't know anything yet, Madison said quietly. She slid down the wall and lay on the floor. She couldn't take the pain any longer. An ambulance. I can't lose the baby. Maybe it's for the best? Chris asked thoughtfully. You'll lose the baby, and you and Richard won't have anything to do. What's going on here? Suddenly there was a loud male voice. Through the pain, Madison recognized the voice as Oswald's. I came to talk to her about Richard and me, Chris said. She was talking fast and rambling. Suddenly she felt sick because she was pregnant. Madison, you're pregnant? Oswald interjected. Call an ambulance. Madison asked with all her might and fainted. Madison woke up in the hospital. There was a metal IV stand with a needle inserted into her right arm. The medication was slowly dripping down the tube. Is there anyone here? The girl whispered. Oh, you've come to your senses. An elderly woman who was lying on the next bed came to life. She pressed the nurse call button. A couple of minutes later, a large middle-aged woman entered the room. Despite her fullness, her movements were quick and precise. Tell me, what's wrong with me? Madison asked. Shush, the nurse said with a smile. Tomorrow morning the doctor will come to see you. He will tell you everything. In the meantime, rest. The nurse examined Madison and left the room. After she left, her roommate came over and sat down on a chair next to her. My name is Mrs. Megan, the woman introduced herself. What's yours? Madison. What a rare name these days, the neighbor smiled. You scared the girls last night. Can you tell me if you know what's wrong with my baby? Quietly asked the girl. What I don't know, Mrs. Megan waved her hand. They brought you in last night and put you here. It was awful to look at you. You were covered in IVs and wires. I see, Madison said. What a fiancé you have. The older woman smacked her tongue as she thought of Richard. Madison's heart clenched. In spite of everything, she loved that bastard. Why do you say that? The girl inquired. How was he here worried about you? You have no idea, Mrs. Megan shook her head. I was just seeing my son off when they brought you in by ambulance. Your husband wouldn't leave your side until the nurse chased him away. Otherwise, he'd have gone into surgery with you. The OR? Madison was dizzy from what she'd just heard. So there was something wrong with her baby if she was in surgery. Maybe that's why the nurse left the bad news to the doctor. And before I went to bed, I looked out of the window. Your fiancé was sitting on a bench, waiting for someone from the medical staff to come out and tell him what's wrong with you, the old woman continued to tell me without noticing the slim appearance of her new neighbor. Already close to night, he left. Can you imagine? Why was Richard here all this time? Doesn't he care about me? If he has another woman? Madison replied, confused. Yes. And he's been here since this morning, the older woman continued. Came to check on you. Are they allowed in here? No, but he talked the nurse into it, Mrs. Megan said in a confidential tone. So she let him in for 5 minutes. When he saw you, he fell to his knees in front of you. Forgive me, says Madison. Madison, you fool. If I'd known you were having a baby, I never would have done this. He said that. The girl was surprised. Word for word. Here's a cross for you. The old woman crossed herself. Yes, I believe you, Mrs. Megan. Madison smiled. What's next? He kneels down in front of you, kisses your hand, and cries and cries. And how can he not cry when he's guilty before you? Mrs. Megan wondered. Oswald may love you, but what has he done wrong if it's his fault you lost the baby? What did you say? Madison was stunned. How did I lose the baby? Oh, I'm just rambling on. I'm going for a walk. The older woman quickly got up from her chair and left the room. Mrs. Megan, wait, shouted the girl. But the neighbor didn't even stop. Tears sprang from Madison's eyes. Despite Richard's betrayal, she wanted this child. The girl had dreamed of a child since childhood. At first, she had asked her parents for a brother or sister, but they had stubbornly refused, citing financial difficulties. Madison knew that her parents were lying to her, because their income allowed to give birth and raise at least 2 or even 3 more children. Mom just didn't want to bother with nappies and cradles. She was more satisfied with a quiet life, where she could at any moment pack her things and go on holiday. And her father, who loved his wife madly, indulged her in everything and did not cross her. Then Madison firmly decided that she would have 3 children. And when she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. And now her dream has come crashing down. Suddenly, Madison frowned. Why did Mrs. Megan call Oswald her fiancé? Now there were more questions than answers. The girl waited for her neighbor, but she persistently did not return. At that moment, a nurse came in. She deftly gave Madison an injection. All manipulations of the nurse were accompanied by silence. After a couple of minutes, the girl fell asleep. The next morning, when Madison opened her eyes, the elderly neighbor pretended not to notice the girl. Mrs. Megan, talk to me, please, the girl asked quietly. But the woman persisted in reading her book. A couple of minutes later, a doctor accompanied by a nurse entered the room. Hello, Madison. My name is Jonathan. I'm your doctor. How are you feeling? Doctor, what's wrong with my baby? Madison asked her question. Unfortunately, we couldn't save the fetus. The man shook his head. You were bleeding heavily and we had to save you. There was nothing we could do for your baby. Madison couldn't speak, the lump in her throat preventing her from doing so. Madison, I realize that what I'm going to say now will not calm you down. The doctor took the girl's hand. But you're still young. You'll definitely have children in the future. You just need to heal a little now, and everything will be fine. Promise? Madison asked hopefully. I promise, Jonathan answered. After the doctor left, Mrs. Megan sat down next to Madison. I didn't say those things out of spite, she said peacefully. It was just something I said without thinking. Mrs. Megan, you knew from the beginning that I'd lost the baby, didn't you? The girl said with resentment in her voice. And you gave me hope to think that it wasn't so bad. I'd been telling myself that I was going to be a mum. Forgive me, old fool. Tears appeared in the woman's eyes. I wanted to support you, but it didn't work out. You know, I know firsthand what it's like to lose a child. You do? Madison asked interestedly. Yes, after graduating from the Teacher Training Institute, I was sent to a town near Kansas. I felt the happiest because I was on my own. I was finally out of my mother's control. I came to the town, got a job at the school. It was a lot of work, but it didn't scare me. On the contrary, my enthusiasm was bursting. I spent all day at school, organizing the leisure time of the pupils in addition to lessons. Mrs. Megan stopped talking and turned away from the window. Madison was afraid to move so as not to disturb her neighbor's nostalgia. There was a steel mill next to the school. I once had to accompany my students on a field trip to the plant. We were met at the entrance hall by Charles, the honorary metallurgist, who knew the history of the plant like the back of his hand. He led us through the main shop where steel was cooked. The boys were shown the smelting process. You can't imagine the eyes my children looked at it with. Then we were introduced to the best brigade of the plant and its master, Alex. When I saw him, I immediately realized that I was missing his smile drove me crazy. As it turned out later, our feelings were mutual. The old woman smiled at her memories. 6 months later, we got married. The whole town was celebrating our wedding. It seemed there was no happier couple in the whole world. We always did everything together. We cooked dinner together, cleaned, did the laundry. And when I realized I was pregnant, I thought I'd go crazy with happiness. One day my husband didn't meet me after school. At first I thought that he was delayed at work, so I went to the factory gate. The closer I got, the more anxious I became. There were people standing around the gatehouse. I could tell something was wrong. Mrs. Megan stood up, went to the bedside table and poured herself a glass of water. The woman's hands were shaking. It was obvious that it still hurt her to remember those events. She was rambling, but Madison understood her perfectly. As it turned out, there had been an explosion at the factory, and several people had been hurt. And Alex was killed, Mrs. Megan said. Oh my God, Madison whispered in horror, pressing her palm to her mouth. When I got the news, I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital. That's when my roommate told me all about the explosion at the factory and the dead foreman. The most interesting thing is that she didn't even know that I was the wife of the foreman. You can't imagine the colors in which she described it all. And the cherry on the cake was my child whom I lost. My neighbor told me about it as if her milk had gone sour in the fridge, in passing, by the way. How I screamed. I was sedated so much that it is impossible to imagine. After I was discharged from the hospital, I immediately wrote a letter of resignation. I packed my things and went back home to my mom. I couldn't live in this town where everything reminded me of my beloved husband and our unborn child. Mrs. Megan, I'm sorry, I was wrong, Madison said guiltily. I'm the one who should be apologizing to you, the neighbor said with a pleading tone in her voice. I acted like that tactless old woman. I'm so ashamed, Madison whispered. It wasn't your fault at all. You just wanted what was best for me, so that I wouldn't have to go through the pain that you did. At that moment, a nurse came into the room. Madison, how are you feeling? She asked. I'm fine. Then go out into the lobby. Why? Madison was surprised. Your fiancé is here to see you. Madison sighed heavily. She had made the decision to break up with Richard. Despite her love for him, she couldn't forgive his betrayal, which had resulted in the loss of her child. Madison slowly stood up and headed for the lobby. It was time to start a new life without lies and deceit. She walked slowly down the corridor, mentally reciting to herself what she had to say to Richard. The only thing that confused her was why her ex-fiancé had come to the hospital to apologize, or, on the contrary, to laugh at her for being such a fool. Going out into the lobby, the girl was dumbfounded. Oswald was standing in front of her. Seeing Madison, the man walked quickly towards her. "Madison, hello," Oswald said. "How are you? How are you feeling? What did the doctors say when you will be discharged?" "Stop," Madison said in an orderly tone. "Not so fast, I don't have time to answer all your questions. I'll start by asking you what you're doing here." "What do you mean?" The young man was taken aback. "I came to check on you. I also brought some fruit." Oswald handed Madison a transparent plastic bag containing oranges and apples. "Thank you," Madison thanked her guest quietly. Take, don't be shy," Oswald smiled. "It's my pleasure to take care of you. I know very well how they feed in hospitals. Besides, you need vitamins now." "That's true," the girl shrugged her shoulders. She nodded her head and pointed to a bench near the window. "Let's go and sit down." "Come on, tell me about it," the young man said, sitting down on the bench next to Madison. "I feel better now," Madison said quietly. "Unfortunately, I lost the baby." The girl was silent. She tried not to cry in front of Oswald. "I know," Oswald lowered his head guiltily. "It was my fault that it happened like that." "Why?" Madison jumped up. "If I hadn't brought Richard into our firm, he wouldn't have met her, and my brother wouldn't have cheated on you." "Oswald, don't blame yourself," Madison took his hand. "It's not your fault. What is to be is not to be avoided. You see, if we're not meant to be with Richard, then so be it." "Do you really think so?" Oswald asked hopefully. "Yes, I believe in signs of fate," Madison confirmed. "So do not worry. Everything that is done, for the best. It's just a shame I lost the baby. I'm getting used to the idea that I'm going to be a mum soon." "Don't worry, honey." The young man took the girl's hands in his. "You will heal and rest a little now, and you will definitely have children in the future." "I hope so," Madison smiled. "Madison, my dear, I've wanted to tell you something for a long time." Oswald looked straight into the girl's eyes. "You don't need Richard. A girl like you deserves more than that." "Oswald, what are you talking about?" Madison asked in a daze. "My darling, my love, you deserve to be loved, carried in his arms," Oswald passionately whispered. "I beg you, forget my foolish brother. Give me a chance to be near you. I love you very much." "Oswald, are you crazy?" Madison tried to pull her hands out of the iron grip of the guest, but he only squeezed them harder, not giving her the opportunity to get free. Suddenly, the girl screamed. "You're hurting me." "Darling, I'm sorry, please." The young man, without letting go of her hands, began to kiss them. "Oswald, let me go." But he, as if possessed by an invisible force, did not hear the girl's screams and continued to kiss her hands. Madison began to resist. She hid a bag of fruit that was lying nearby on a bench, causing apples and oranges to scatter on the lobby floor. "What's going on here?" Suddenly, a loud male voice was heard next to them, which sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. Oswald blushed in surprise and let go of Madison with a sudden movement. He looked at the tall, formidable man who had appeared as if out of thin air, eyes wide open. "I came to check on Madison," Oswald said, stammering. I can see that Jonathan's eyes flashed with lightning. I can also see that the patient doesn't like it. "So, young man, your appointment hours are over for today," Jonathan said in a tone that did not tolerate any objections. "But..." Oswald tried to say something to the doctor, but he didn't let him. "Should I call security?" Jonathan asked icily. "I'm leaving," Madison said through gritted teeth. He walked towards the exit, turned round at the door, and said goodbye to the girl. "I'll come and see you tomorrow." Don't, Madison shouted, but Oswald didn't even turn round. Yes, Madison, what a fiancé you have. Madison's doctor shook his head in disapproval. Madison looked at Jonathan carefully. Who was he to judge her choice? Oswald is not my fiancé, Madison snapped at him. But this young man thinks otherwise, Jonathan said thoughtfully. I don't care what Oswald thinks. Madison walked past the doctor, heading for the room. He's just my ex-fiancé's cousin. Madison, are you forgetting something? Jonathan shouted after her. What, she asked, turning around. This. The doctor deftly picked up an orange from the floor and threw it to Madison. The girl orientated herself and caught the fruit. I don't need it, Madison smiled and tossed the orange back to Jonathan. No, that's no good, the man said in a jokingly menacing tone. He was about to throw the orange back, but the girl quickly walked over to him and took the fruit. My parents taught me not to throw food around. And you're throwing vitamins, by the way, she scolded the doctor. Madison walked over to the bench where the bag was lying, picked it up and began to pick up the fruit. Jonathan looked at her. Why are you looking at me? She said jokingly. Come on, help me. The man bent down and started picking oranges and apples. The two of them quickly picked up everything that was lying on the floor. When the last orange was left on the floor, Madison and Jonathan reached for it at the same time and their fingers touched. The young men jerked their hands sharply away from the fruit as if they had been electrocuted. Madison looked straight into her doctor's eyes. Suddenly she wanted to disappear into the green pool of Jonathan's eyes, but she quickly averted her gaze so as not to cause more trouble. Madison took the fruit and put it in the bag. Thank you, she said in a quiet voice. You're welcome, the man replied in a husky voice. Now go back to your room. You need to rest. Jonathan turned round and went to his office. Madison stared after him for a long time. What just happened? It must be a surge of hormones after losing a child, she thought. She took the bag of fruit and went to her room. Madison, what took you so long? Mrs. Megan asked. I'm waiting for you. I'm exhausted. Why are you waiting for me? Madison was surprised. Then she handed a bag of fruit to her neighbor. Here's a treat for you. Would you like some company? Oh, thank you. The older woman smiled. Why don't you eat it yourself? Your fiancé brought it for you. You've got it mixed up. It's not my fiancé, it's his brother, the girl corrected her neighbor. What brother? Mrs. Megan was taken aback. I heard him say he was your fiancé when they brought you in. And then he was on his knees in that room begging your forgiveness. Oswald apologized to me for getting Richard a job at the firm where he worked. That's where Richard had an affair with this Chris. Now Oswald blames himself for my losing the baby. Wow, the woman grinned. That's how life sometimes twists and turns. Yeah, Madison agreed. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. Madison, did you have a full house today? The nurse said with a smile. Go. Your fiancé is here to see you again. What fiancé? Mrs. Megan asked, squinting her eyes. Why, do you have lots of them? The nurse asked. No, just one, Madison said. And it was an ex. The girl didn't know what she should do. What if it's Oswald back? The last thing Madison wanted was to see him. What if Richard had a guilty conscience and decided to visit Madison? What's the point of guessing? We'll have to go out and see. Only Madison was a little apprehensive after the ugly scene Oswald had caused today. She didn't want to see him, much less talk to him. Taking a deep breath, Madison walked into the lobby. Richard was standing near the window, looking in. The girl grinned and felt a moment of déjà vu. Exactly an hour ago, she had walked out to Oswald, who was standing looking through that window. "Richard, what are you doing here?" the girl asked in a harsh tone. "What do you mean?" Richard was dumbfounded. He walked quickly to the girl and wanted to hug her, but Madison dodged his embrace. "Don't," Madison said firmly. "I asked you a question." "Madison, what's wrong with you?" The young man was taken aback. "I came to see you. I just got back from a business trip today. I was urgently sent on company business to another city. Oswald was supposed to tell you." "Richard, don't make excuses," the girl stood her ground. "I know the truth that Chris came to see me, and she told me everything." "Told you what?" Richard asked in surprise. "You're so good at acting surprised," Madison grinned. "I can't believe how good you are at acting." "Madison, can you explain to me in a human way what happened?" Richard asked demandingly. "Why did Chris come to see you?" "She told me the truth about you two being together and in love." "There must be some mistake." The young man furrowed his eyebrows. "Why is that?" Madison grinned. "Because she and Oswald have been dating for 2 months now and are in a serious relationship." Madison looked at Richard dumbfounded. She was completely confused as to whether Oswald was in a relationship with Chris. Then why had he confessed his love to her today? Madison looked at Richard carefully. "You're not confused about anything, are you?" she asked with a frown. "Madison, do you think I'm an idiot?" The young man was indignant. "The thing is that on Thursday, when I was in the hospital, Chris came to my house and told me that you were having an affair with her. She asked me to let you go to her." "That doesn't make any sense." Richard sat down on the bench. He looked at Madison carefully. "If you didn't know anything about me being in the hospital, how did you end up here?" Madison decided to find out the whole truth. "I came home and you were gone," the young man explained. "I called your phone, but you were off the hook." "Yes, because I blocked you," the girl confirmed. "Why?" "Don't play dumb?" Madison grinned. "But you still haven't answered my question." The girl was determined to get to the truth. "How did you know I was in the hospital?" "I came home, and our beloved neighbor, Mrs. Cassandra, told me in all the colors that you were taken away by ambulance. Do you understand?" "Okay," Madison said. "Honey, tell me what happened to you," Richard asked. "Nothing. Except that my fiancé is cheating on me," she blurted out. "I lost the baby." "Stop." The young man tried to realize the meaning of Madison's words. "What baby?" "Ours." "But why didn't you tell me you were pregnant before?" "I was going to tell you that Thursday when I went into the hospital," Madison grinned. "Instead, I found out about your affair." "How can you not realize that I'm not having an affair with this Chris?" Richard raised his voice. "Don't yell at me." Madison was indignant. "Your brother, by the way, says otherwise," Madison said. "He even apologized. That he introduced you to her." "Oswald?" The young man mumbled confusedly. "But he's lying. I would never cheat on you." "Why would he do that?" Madison cut the young man's speech short. "I don't know." Richard suddenly lost his temper. He walked over to Madison and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Look, I'm not guilty of anything." "I'm hurt." Madison tried to break free of the young man's iron grip. "Let me go." Jonathan walked past the lobby at that moment. He took a quick step toward Richard and pulled him away from Madison. "What kind of day is this?" The doctor looked indignantly at his patient. "Madison, is a hospital a place to get into a relationship?" "I'm sorry," the girl replied, lowering her head. She was embarrassed that Jonathan had witnessed such an ugly scene. It was the second time in one day. What would he think of her now? Young man, the man said in a firm tone, addressing Richard, I urge you to leave the hospital. Otherwise I'll be forced to call security. But I've come to visit my fiancé. Ex-fiancé Madison cut in. Especially ex-fiancé Jonathan added. Any questions, please, after you've been discharged from the hospital. Your fiancé has lost a child. She needs to regain her strength both physically and mentally. Madison, get me off the blacklist, please, Richard asked. Why? So I can at least call you. Richard, there's no need for that, Madison said tiredly. She was exhausted from the fight with Oswald and Richard. Get your things and get out of my flat. I'm going to the hospital. I don't think we need to hurry, Richard said. I'll wait for you and we'll talk about it. You see, I've already made up my mind, and talking about it isn't going to change anything, Madison said. And you're just delaying the inevitable. I'll wait for you, Richard said. He wanted to kiss Madison goodbye, but she wouldn't let him. I'll wait for you at home, the young man said and left. Jonathan looked at the girl. What kind of strange suitors do you have? The doctor grinned. I'm shocked. Madison walked slowly into the room. She wanted to lie in bed and cover herself so she wouldn't have to see anyone or anything else today. Madison silently walked into the room and got into bed. Mrs. Megan, try as she might, could not get her neighbor to talk. The older woman took great offense at Madison for not saying anything to her. How was the meeting with the next fiancé thought? But the girl didn't care about her neighbor's feelings. She would have to sort out her own. The girl could not sleep for a long time. She couldn't understand which of the two brothers was lying to her, which of them was pursuing his own advantage, and most importantly, what kind. Madison decided to make a confrontation for all three: Richard, Oswald, and Chris. That this girl has a relationship with one of the brothers, there is no doubt. Just whose side is she playing on? It remains to think of such a situation to catch all three together by surprise. The only place where all the conditions match perfectly is the firm where all three work. All the following days, Madison carefully avoided meeting her brothers, although they regularly came to visit the girl. The last thing she wanted to do was talk to them. Madison realized that her love for Richard was just an obsession. At first, she didn't like his advances. Then she dreamed of his future fame as a famous computer programmer. And then the girl felt sorry for the unrecognized genius, because he had worked so hard to write this super program. And when the truth came out that the program was a figment of Richard's dreams, she felt offended that she had been tricked for so long. As they say, everything is for the best, Madison thought. She spent all her free time at the hospital with Jonathan. At first, the attending physician seemed like a serious man who was only interested in medicine. In fact, Jonathan, as he asked to be called, was only 10 years older than her. His range of interests was so broad that Madison couldn't imagine how she could know so much. They spent days and evenings talking, and each time the subject was different. During this time, she learned a lot of new and useful information. And at the same time, Jonathan was not a connoisseur and did not try to be clever. Unlike her ex-fiancé, who at every opportunity let Madison know that she was stupid. The day of the discharge came. Madison couldn't hide her disappointment. This is it, she sighed sadly as she walked into her doctor's office. Why are you sighing so sadly? Jonathan smiled. I am being discharged today, and it's time to break up. Madison shrugged. You sound like you're going to another planet. Madison, why are you so sad? The man came up to the girl and put his arm around her. Are you saying that our relationship is over? Can't we continue it outside the hospital? Is that what you want? Madison asked hopefully. I do, Jonathan answered. As soon as I saw you, I knew we had to be together. You do? The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. Really, Jonathan kissed her cheek, which made Madison blush. She was pleased with the man's advances. There was one thing I didn't like. What's that? Madison frowned. Their relationship hadn't even begun yet, and already there were complaints. Madison, please deal with your brothers. I don't want them around you all the time. Plus, I'm confessing my love for you. Don't worry about that, she exhaled. I have an idea how to get them out. Which one do you think is lying? I don't know, Madison admitted honestly. What if Richard is telling the truth? And he hasn't cheated on you? Jonathan asked with concern in his voice. Would you go back to him? No, Madison answered. The situation had made it clear to me that I hadn't loved Richard for a long time. It was clear to me that I had treated him like a little child. Why? Jonathan wondered. I felt sorry for him, and I treated him like a piece of paper. He sat on my neck for so long and manipulated me. And I was stupid enough to let him do it because I felt sorry for him. How can it be that Richard works so hard, and his program still doesn't appeal to his customers? As it turned out, it was his idea, and no one ever wanted his software. I see Jonathan pulled her tighter against him. What are your plans for today? I want to get all my stuff home first. Take a shower. Madison rested her head on Jonathan's shoulder. And then I want to go to that firm where all three of them work. Why? Why? She grinned. I want to catch them in an uncomfortable situation. That way I'll get them out in the open quicker. I won't let you go there alone. Jonathan was determined. I'm coming with you. I'm just finishing my workday for the day. Great. Madison kissed the man. You'll be a great support. I'm going to go pack. I'll be waiting for you downstairs in the car. Jonathan smiled at her. He was glad he had met her. He was glad that he had met her. It so happened that all the girls he had relationships with did not understand his attitude towards work. After all, Jonathan gave himself to it completely, and the girls were capricious, forcing him to choose between work and them. Jonathan had always chosen work, as it was the only thing he saw the meaning of his life in. It was only now, when Madison came along, that he realized what it was to love and be with this girl all the more. Madison understood him and accepted him for who he was, and now he would do anything to make this fragile girl happy. Walking out of the hospital into the street, Madison breathed a full sigh. How she had missed fresh air all this time. Madison, don't stay out in the cool air too long, or you'll catch a cold. Jonathan shouted. He was standing outside his car waiting for the girl. When he saw Madison, the man opened the car door for her. Please, my princess, the carriage is here, he said. Thank you, my king. Madison smiled back. She was pleased with Jonathan's advances, unlike Richard, who never even gave her a hand when she got off the bus. The gallant Jonathan's manners were on point. Where are we going? The man asked as he got into the car. Home first, Madison replied happily. I want to take a quick shower to wash off all the hospital odors. No hard feelings, okay? Even though I love my job so much, every time I come home from the hospital I shower and wash my clothes too. I feel like I smell sick. Then go home now, Jonathan commanded. When they entered their flat, the girl's mood had dropped considerably. It was obvious that Richard had never moved out. She picked up her former young man's traveling bag and quickly threw Richard's things into it. Well, that's it, I guess, said a satisfied Madison as she walked around the flat and looked around. She didn't want any little thing to remind her of their former relationship. Jonathan, I'm going to take a shower. Could you put the kettle on? I'm dying for a sip of green tea. As you say, my princess, the man kissed the girl on the cheek and went to the kitchen. An hour later, the young people headed to the firm where the brothers worked. The girl just couldn't wait to look them both in the eyes, as well as to set things straight. When Madison and Jonathan entered the office where the brothers worked, they saw Oswald kissing Chris. What an interesting picture. Madison grinned. And you, girl, I see that you are not bad. You're having an affair with two brothers at once. Madison, what are you doing here? Oswald was confused. Then he looked at Jonathan, and he was instantly angry. And your protector is here. We've come to set things straight, Jonathan said, explaining his presence. Where's Richard? Madison asked. I don't think we can find out the truth without him. I'm here. Richard walked into the office. I was on a call. Madison, hi. You been discharged? Yeah, today. Madison held out a bag of her ex-fiance's stuff. Here, this is yours. Did you decide to break up with me after all? Richard sighed sadly. Yes, I realize that you and I are too different, so you and I are no longer on the same path. That's a shame. You're a fool, brother. Oswald grinned wryly. If I were you, I wouldn't let Madison go. I'd fight for her. What's the point? Richard asked indifferently. Believe me, I know that look in Madison's eyes. She's not in love with me anymore. Wait, are you saying Madison is with that right now? Oswald pointed his head at Jonathan. Choose your words, young man, Jonathan warned in a cautionary tone. Or what? Oswald asked defiantly. All right, everybody calm down. Madison looked angrily at those present. Oswald, I want to thank you. For what? Stupefied young man. If it hadn't been for your adventure, I would never have met Jonathan. The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. I would have lived on hopes and promises of a better life. Madison, I can give you an even better one. Oswald began. But he was interrupted by Chris, who screamed hysterically. Honey, what's all this? The girl stomped her foot. First you swore to me in love, saying that you want to marry. And then you actually did? Jesus, Chris, look at yourself, Oswald grinned. I just needed you to come to Madison and introduce yourself as Richard's fiancée. That's all I needed. You used me? Chris squealed. Do you think it's possible to have a serious relationship with someone like you? Oswald grinned. You are only for fun and nothing more. Not like Madison. How is she better than me? Chris looked at her rival with dislike. Everything, Oswald replied. Look at you and her. It is because of women like Madison committed feats. Enough. Madison ordered. I'm not interested in your relations, came out the boss and turned to those present. Oswald, I never want you in my life again. If it weren't for your pregnancy, I would have succeeded, Oswald said angrily. The only thing that would have worked out for you is that Richard and I would have split up, Madison said firmly. But I would never have been with you, that's for sure. I hope that was the last time we see each other. That goes for the three of you. Shall we go? Jonathan asked. He put his arm around Madison's shoulders. Let's go, she smiled at her lover. Suddenly her gaze fell on Richard, who stood like a child abandoned by his mother. He lowered his head and did not know what he should do next. For a moment she felt sorry for her former fiancé, but the girl quickly pulled herself together. After all, Richard was a man who had to become independent. Madison and Jonathan left the office. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. God, I can breathe easy. Madison smiled. Then she kissed Jonathan on the cheek. Where are we going? Let's go to the park and walk, she suggested. That's a great idea. Madison took Jonathan's hand. She was happy to have met him. She saw in him all the qualities of a man she had always dreamed of. In the short time they had known each other, Jonathan had proved himself to be responsible, honest, and wise. He had become a friend to Madison, someone she could confide in. This man would not hesitate to lean on her shoulder in times of need, and he was the only one she was willing to share the family's troubles with.